The deafening silence that followed Victoria Richards' laughter echoed through the private hangar. All eyes shifted between her, the immaculate CEO of Westfield Aerospace, and Bob Callahan, the grease-stained mechanic who had dared suggest he could fix the Boeing 787's malfunctioning engine. A local garage mechanic thinks he understands advanced aerospace engineering. Victoria's voice dripped with contempt. This isn't changing oil in pickup trucks, Mr. Callahan. That's a $12 million GE9X engine with proprietary modifications. I need certified engineers, not— Her eyes lingered on his worn coveralls. Overconfident handymen playing with toys they don't understand. The hangar staff looked away uncomfortably. The sleek, custom-modified 787 dominated the space, its massive engine cowling open like a patient on an operating table. Red warning lights still flashed on the diagnostic equipment surrounding it. Bob Callahan didn't flinch. At 62, his weathered face had seen worse than the scorn of corporate executives. The lines around his eyes deepened slightly as he nodded once and turned to leave, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Your call, ma'am," he said quietly. "But that turbine blade didn't crack because of manufacturing stress. It's a harmonics issue from the modified fuel delivery system. Good luck explaining to the Pentagon why their demonstration flight got canceled." Victoria's spine stiffened. "Excuse me, how would you possibly know that?" Bob shrugged. 30 years working with jet engines leaves an impression. You start to recognize their voices. He tapped his ear. "That whine when you powered up, not normal. But like you said, I'm just a garage mechanic." As the hangar doors closed behind him, Victoria turned to her nervous operations manager. "How long until our team arrives from Seattle?" 8 hours minimum, Ms. Richards. The storm system's grounded everything on the West Coast." Victoria glanced at her watch, then at the military officers gathering in the observation room. The demonstration flight, the one that would secure or lose them the $1.2 billion contract, was scheduled for 0900 tomorrow. "Find me someone else," she ordered. "Ma'am, there isn't anyone else, not within 300 miles, who's certified on these engines." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. "Then why was that mechanic even brought in here?" The operations manager swallowed hard. "The airport manager suggested him. Said Callahan's fixed everything from Cessnas to old military jets at the local airfield. Apparently he's something of a local legend." "A legend," Victoria repeated flatly. "Wonderful." What Victoria Richards couldn't see beneath those stained coveralls was the man Robert Bob Callahan had once been, and still was, despite everything life had thrown at him. The modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street in Riverdale looked like any other on the block, distinguished only by the meticulously maintained 1967 Corvette Stingray in the driveway. Inside, Bob was frying bacon for his son's breakfast before school. "Dad, seriously, I can make my own breakfast," Michael protested, though he was already setting the table. At 17, he had his father's height and analytical mind tempered by an easy smile that Bob recognized from Sarah, his late wife. "Humor your old man," Bob replied, sliding perfectly crisp bacon onto a plate. "Last I checked, making breakfast for my son wasn't a federal crime." "Mrs. Peterson called yesterday about the science fair," Michael said, pouring orange juice. "They want to know if you'd be a judge again this year." Bob nodded. "Tell her yes, but I'm not wearing a tie." "Fair enough," Michael hesitated. "Also, Mr. Harmon at the airfield said a corporate jet came in yesterday with engine trouble. Something big." Bob's hands stilled momentarily over the frying pan. "That right?" "Yeah, said it was one of those new Boeing 787s with the modified engines. The really quiet ones." Michael's eyes lit up. "Think they'll let you take a look at it?" "Doubtful," Bob said, returning to the eggs. "Those corporate types don't usually trust local mechanics with their multi-million-dollar toys." "Their loss," Michael said, with the absolute confidence of a son who believed his father could fix anything. "You built those engines." Bob smiled faintly. "That was a long time ago, Mike." "Not that long," Michael countered, pulling a framed magazine cover from the bookshelf. "Aviation Weekly 2010. GE's revolutionary new engine design, Dr. Robert Callahan's team breaks efficiency records." Bob took the frame gently and returned it to the shelf. "Eat your eggs before they get cold. You've got that calculus test first period." After dropping Michael at school, Bob drove his old Ford pickup to Miller's Auto Shop, where he'd worked since moving to Riverdale 5 years ago. The familiar smells of motor oil and rubber greeted him as he entered, nodding to the younger mechanics already at work. "Morning, Bob." Tom Miller called from beneath a lifted Chevy Silverado. "Thought you weren't in until noon today." "Change of plans," Bob replied, hanging his jacket on a hook and pulling on his work coveralls. "Mrs. Abernathy's Buick come in yet?" "Nope, but you got a call from Riverdale Airfield. Jake says they've got a corporate jet with engine trouble. Asked specifically for you." Bob paused. "What kind of engine trouble?" "Didn't say, just that it was important. Some big demonstration flight scheduled." Bob's side memories stirring of high-pressure deadlines and multi-million-dollar projects, of endless nights in test facilities and the rush of watching a new design take flight, of everything he'd walked away from when Sarah got sick. "I'll give Jake a call," he said, reaching for the shop phone. An hour later, Bob found himself staring up at the gleaming Boeing 787 in Hangar 3 of Riverdale Regional Airport. The aircraft was a corporate demonstrator customized with Westfield Aerospace's distinctive dark blue livery and gold trim. The logo, a stylized W with wings, was prominently displayed on the tail. The hangar staff were visibly relieved to see him. "Thank God you're here, Bob," Jake Simmons, the airport manager, said. "These folks are having a conniption fit over their fancy jet." "What's the problem?" Bob asked, already scanning the open engine cowling. "GE9X with Westfield's proprietary modifications. Something's wrong with the turbine, but their diagnostics aren't making sense. They've got big military brass coming for a demonstration tomorrow." Bob nodded, his experienced eyes already picking up details the average mechanic would miss. The engine wasn't just any GE9X. It incorporated the experimental thrust vectoring system he'd helped design before leaving GE, a system that had still been in testing when he'd resigned. "Who's in charge?" he asked, removing his jacket. Jake grimaced. "Victoria Richards, CEO herself, and Bob, she's not exactly the friendly type." "Never met a CEO who was," Bob replied, mildly rolling up his sleeves. The confrontation with Victoria Richards went exactly as he'd expected. Corporate types never trusted local talent, no matter their qualifications. Too much ego wrapped up in their expensive equipment and prestigious teams. As Bob drove back to Miller's auto shop, he wasn't thinking about the dismissal or the condescension. He was thinking about the engine, about the particular quality of its startup whine and the pattern of vibration he'd felt through the hangar floor, about the modifications he could see and the ones he suspected they'd made to his original designs. Mostly he was thinking about what would happen when those military officials discovered their showcase flight had been canceled because Westfield's team had overlooked something fundamental, something he could have fixed in under 3 hours. Victoria Richards had earned her reputation as the Iron Lady of Aviation through meticulous precision and uncompromising standards. At 58, she transformed her father's struggling defense subcontractor into Westfield Aerospace, one of the nation's premier aviation innovation companies, catering to executives, celebrities, and increasingly military contracts that demanded nothing less than perfection. Her corner office overlooking Westfield's main production facility featured no family photos, only awards industry recognitions, and a large model of their flagship 787 demonstrator, the same aircraft now stranded at Riverdale Regional with a malfunctioning engine. The daughter of Colonel James Richards, a decorated test pilot turned businessman, Victoria had graduated with highest honors from MIT's Aerospace Engineering program before earning her MBA at Harvard. Her father's unexpected death had thrust her into leadership at 39, and she'd spent the subsequent years proving herself in an industry dominated by men who constantly underestimated her. Victoria's days were choreographed with military precision, 5 a.m. workouts, breakfast meetings, operational reviews, client calls, and strategy sessions that often stretched past midnight. Her assistant knew better than to schedule anything during her Sunday afternoon flying time, the only moments when Victoria truly felt free, piloting her personal Citation CJ-4 through the skies above New England. Now pacing the small office at Riverdale Regional Airport, Victoria faced a crisis that threatened years of work. The Pentagon contract wasn't just another piece of business, it was validation. Proof that a woman-led company could compete with the traditional defense contractors who dominated military aviation for decades. "What do you mean options are limited?" she demanded, glaring at her operations director through the video call. "This is absolutely unacceptable, Phillips." I understand your frustration, ma'am, Phillips replied carefully. But with the weather system grounding all flights on the West Coast, our engineering teams simply cannot get there before tomorrow morning. We're exploring charter options from the East Coast facilities, but nothing. I need solutions, not excuses. Victoria ended the call abruptly and turned to the window watching technicians scurry around her grounded aircraft. Her mind calculated rapidly. The demonstration couldn't be postponed. The military procurement team's schedule was inflexible, and any delay would give their competitors at Raytheon and Lockheed Martin time to undermine Westfield's position. The local mechanic's words echoed in her mind. A harmonics issue from the modified fuel delivery system. It was precisely the kind of problem that could arise from their recent modifications. But how would a small-town garage mechanic recognize such a specific issue? Victoria prided herself on knowing every employee in her company, on understanding the technical aspects of their work, even as she focused on executive leadership. Her father's voice echoed in her head. Never ask someone to do a job you don't understand yourself, Vicky. She pulled out her tablet and accessed Westfield's personnel database. A quick search confirmed what she already suspected: Robert Callahan had never worked for Westfield Aerospace. Next, she tried the industry database. Nothing. Whoever this mechanic was, he wasn't currently registered with any major aviation manufacturer or maintenance provider. Victoria frowned. Either the man was completely bluffing or, "Get me everything you can find on Robert Callahan," she instructed her assistant over the phone, "and have someone bring that local mechanic back here. Immediately." As she waited, Victoria reviewed the diagnostic data from the engine. The readings were inconsistent, suggesting either multiple failures or, more likely, a fundamental issue that was causing cascading errors in the monitoring systems. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message. Her assistant had sent a sparse file: Robert Joseph Callahan, age 62, current employment at Miller's Auto Shop in Riverdale. Previous employment, unavailable. Victoria's frown deepened. This made no sense. No one worked on engines without a documented history in the field. Her phone rang. "Ms. Richards, the local sheriff says Mr. Callahan has declined your invitation to return." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. Declined. His exact words were, "Tell Ms. Richards I don't work where I'm not wanted, and I don't have time for people who make up their minds before looking at the evidence." For the first time that day, Victoria felt a flicker of uncertainty. Those weren't the words of a small-town mechanic looking for a payday. They were the words of someone with confidence, with pride. She looked again at the silent aircraft, then at the waiting military officials who were growing visibly impatient. "Tell Sheriff Bennett I'd like to speak with Mr. Callahan personally," Victoria said, making a decision. "And have my car brought around. I'm going to pay a visit to Miller's Auto Shop." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miller's Auto Shop as Victoria's Range Rover pulled into the gravel parking lot. Her arrival caused an immediate stir among the mechanics, who stopped their work to stare at the luxury vehicle and its impeccably dressed driver. Victoria ignored their attention, scanning the open bay doors until she spotted a pair of boots protruding from beneath an old Jeep Wrangler. A radio played classic rock nearby, Boston's More Than a Feeling, nearly drowning out the metallic clinks of tools against engine parts. Tom Miller emerged from the office, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm looking for Robert Callahan," Victoria replied, her tone making it clear this wasn't a social call. Tom's expression grew guarded. "Bob's busy with a customer's vehicle." "I can see that," Victoria said. "Nevertheless, I need to speak with him. It's regarding the aircraft at Riverdale Regional." From beneath the Jeep, the work sounds paused. After a moment, Bob rolled out on a creeper, his face impassive beneath a sheen of grease and sweat. "Ms. Richards," he acknowledged, sitting up but making no move to stand. "Come to apologize or just to confirm I'm an unqualified handyman?" Several mechanics snickered, quickly silenced by Victoria's sharp glance. "I'd prefer to speak privately, Mr. Callahan." Bob studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward a small break room at the back of the shop. "Coffee's terrible, but it's quiet." In the cramped break room with its ancient coffee maker and faded Pennzoil calendar, Victoria Richards looked distinctly out of place. She declined the offered coffee and came straight to the point. "How did you know about the harmonics issue in the engine?" Bob leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Experience. The same way I know you've modified the thrust vectoring system on the standard GE9X probably to improve maneuverability for military applications. The same way I know those modifications have created resonance problems you didn't anticipate because you rushed testing to meet the Pentagon's deadline. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Who are you, Mr. Callahan, really? Exactly who I appear to be, a mechanic who fixes cars for a living. No, Victoria shook her head. Mechanics don't diagnose advanced aerospace propulsion issues at a glance. They don't recognize proprietary modifications to classified systems. Bob sighed suddenly, looking every one of his 62 years. What do you want, Ms. Richards? I want to know why a man with your obvious expertise is changing oil in a town nobody's heard of. I want to know how you recognize problems with an engine design that's restricted information. And if I tell you, Goss, Bob asked quietly, will you let me fix your engine? Victoria hadn't expected the direct counter. Are you qualified? For the first time, a smile creased Bob's weathered face. More than you know. Their standoff was interrupted by Tom poking his head in. Bob Michaels on the phone says it's important. Something changed in Bob's expression, a softening that Victoria found herself unexpectedly curious about. Excuse me, he said, reaching for the wall phone. Victoria watched as he spoke quietly into the receiver, his posture and tone shifting entirely. Not the gruff mechanic or the confident engineer, but something else. Something paternal. Everything okay, buddy? Uh-huh. No, that's fine. There's leftover meatloaf in the fridge. Yes, I had left the calculations on the kitchen table. Right, love you too. He hung up and turned to find Victoria studying him with new interest. My son, he explained simply. Senior year, science project. Victoria nodded, pieces of the puzzle starting to rearrange themselves in her mind. Mr. Callahan, I have a demonstration flight scheduled for 0900 tomorrow that could determine the future of my company. My engineering team can't get here until it's too late. You seem to understand what's wrong with my engine. I'm asking, she paused, the word unfamiliar in her vocabulary, for your help. Bob's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. And if I say yes, name your consultancy fee within reason. Bob shook his head. I don't want your money, Ms. Richards. Victoria's frustration mounted. Then what do you want? Respect, Bob said simply. No more assumptions, no more condescension. I may not wear a suit or have fancy degrees on my wall anymore, but I know what I'm doing. Anymore. Victoria caught the word immediately. Bob held her gaze steadily. Are we going to fix your engine or debate my resume? Victoria Richards had built her career on calculated risks and trusting her instincts. Everything about this situation defied standard protocol, but something told her Robert Callahan was exactly what he claimed, someone who knew what he was doing. My car's outside, she said. Shall we? As they walked through the shop, Bob stopped to speak with Tom. Family emergency, he explained. Michael's fine, but I need to handle something. Cover for me with Mrs. Abernathy's Buick. Tom glanced between Bob and Victoria, clearly curious, but professional enough not to ask questions. No problem. Take the time you need. In the parking lot, Bob paused beside Victoria's Range Rover. I need to stop by my house first. Need my tools. We have tools at the hangar, Victoria countered. Bob shook his head. Not like mine, you don't. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to Bob's modest house. Wait here, he said. Won't be long. Victoria watched as he disappeared inside her, curiosity growing by the minute. Who exactly was Robert Callahan? And why did she have the distinct feeling she was missing something obvious? Against her better judgment, she stepped out of the car, drawn to the gleaming Corvette in the driveway. The 1967 Stingray was immaculate, clearly lovingly restored and maintained. Not the typical car of a small-town mechanic. She's a beauty, isn't she? Victoria turned to find Bob watching her from the porch, a large worn leather tool case in his hand. His expression was softer now, pride evident as he gazed at the classic car. Restored her myself after Sarah died, he said, approaching the vehicle and running a hand along its flawless finish. Needed something to keep my hands busy at night. Michael helped. He was 12 then, learned to use a torque wrench on that engine. Victoria recognized the tone, the same one her father had used when discussing his vintage P-51 Mustang. The voice of someone who found peace in mechanical perfection. Your wife, she asked quietly. Bob nodded once. Shivaran. Cancer, 5 years ago. The simple statement hung between them, requiring no elaboration or sympathy, just acknowledgement. We should go, Bob said after a moment, hefting his toolcase. That engine won't fix itself. As they drove back toward the airport, Victoria found herself reassessing the man beside her, the calloused hands that spoke of years of hands-on work, the quiet confidence that came not from arrogance but experience. The way he'd spoken to his son on the phone with genuine warmth, rather than the distracted attention she remembered from her own father. Why Riverdale? She asked suddenly. Bob glanced at her. Pardon, why here, small town, middle of nowhere? Not exactly a hub for aerospace expertise. Bob looked out the window at the passing storefronts of Main Street. After Sarah died, Michael needed stability. I needed less pressure. Riverdale had a good school, affordable housing, and an auto shop willing to hire an old-timer who knew his way around engines. That's it. You gave up whatever you were doing before to work in a garage. Bob's expression remained neutral. Some things matter more than career advancement, Ms. Richards. My son needed a father more than the world needed another engineer. The simple statement struck Victoria more deeply than she'd expected. Her own father had chosen the opposite path, prioritizing Westfield's growth over family time, always promising that next year would be different, that success would eventually create space for relationships. He died before that day ever came. Back at Hangar 3, the mood had deteriorated further. The military officials were openly discussing alternative transportation, while Westfield's on-site team looked increasingly desperate. Victoria swept in with Bob, following her confidence, restored now that action was being taken. Gentlemen, she addressed the officials, we've brought in a specialist. The demonstration will proceed as scheduled tomorrow morning. Colonel Harris, the lead procurement officer, looked skeptical. A specialist? From where? Before Victoria could respond, Bob stepped forward, extending his hand. Robert Callahan, sir. Former Air Force 89th Maintenance Group, worked on Air Force One during the Reagan administration. The colonel's demeanor changed instantly. 89th, huh? You boys kept us flying through some interesting times. Good to meet you, Callahan. Victoria blinked, adding another piece to the puzzle of Robert Callahan's past. If you'll excuse us, gentlemen, Bob continued smoothly, I'd like to get started. These GE engines can be temperamental when they're showing off for the brass. The military men chuckled, the tension broken. As they moved away, Victoria stared at Bob with new appreciation. He'd managed in 30 seconds what her team had failed to do in hours: establish credibility and trust with the military officials. Air Force, she questioned quietly. Long time ago, Bob replied, already moving toward the engine. Now let's see what we've got here. What followed was a masterclass in methodical problem solving. Bob worked with quiet efficiency, first reviewing all diagnostic data, then performing his own tests using equipment from his leather case that Victoria didn't recognize. This isn't standard equipment, she observed, watching him connect a specialized analyzer to the engine's control systems. Prototype, Bob replied absently, his focus on the readings. Built it myself for field diagnostics. After 30 minutes of systematic testing, Bob straightened and pointed to a specific component deep within the engine nacelle. There's your problem. The modified thrust vectoring system is creating harmonic vibrations at specific power settings. It's causing microfractures in the turbine blades. Victoria frowned. That's impossible. We tested the modifications extensively. In a test cell, sure, but not on an assembled airframe under varying conditions. Bob shook his head. It's a common oversight. The math looks perfect on paper, but real-world conditions introduce variables you can't always predict. The assessment was delivered matter-of-factly, without condescension or triumph, just professional analysis. Victoria found herself responding in kind, her executive persona giving way to the engineer she'd been before taking over Westfield. How do we fix it? We need to adjust the control algorithm to dampen the resonance at those specific RPM ranges. Essentially, we need to reprogram the engine management system to recognize and correct for the harmonics. Victoria's technical mind engaged fully. That would require access to proprietary software and authorization codes that only our lead engineers have. Bob smiled faintly. Let me worry about that part. For the next 4 hours, Victoria watched in growing amazement as Bob Callahan systematically diagnosed, disassembled, and repaired components of one of the most advanced jet engines in the world. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had intimate knowledge of every part, every system. When they encountered a security restriction in the engine management software, Bob glanced at her. "I need authorization." Victoria hesitated only briefly before entering her override codes, a decision that violated company protocol, but felt inexplicably right. As the afternoon stretched into evening, a small crowd gathered to watch. The military officials returned visibly impressed by the methodical work, and Bob's occasional explanations delivered in the straightforward language of someone who had spent years translating engineering jargon for non-technical officers. The thrust vectoring system is basically telling the engine to change the direction of exhaust flow, he explained to Colonel Harris. Great for maneuverability, but it creates stress patterns conventional engines don't experience. It's like asking a river to suddenly change course, you get turbulence. By 8 p.m., Bob was ready for a test. The hangar fell silent as the engine was powered up, everyone listening intently to the sound of the massive turbofan spooling to life. The whine built steadily, smooth and even, without the irregular pitch Victoria had noted earlier. Bob stood with his eyes closed, listening intently as the RPMs increased. At 80% power, he nodded once in satisfaction. "Run it up to full power," he instructed the technician at the controls. The engine roared, its powerful thrust carefully contained by the testing rig. All diagnostic screens showed green, no warnings, no error codes. "That," Bob said quietly, "is how it's supposed to sound." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the technicians. Even the military officials looked impressed. Victoria found herself staring at Bob with an emotion she rarely experienced in professional settings, genuine admiration. As the celebration continued around them, Victoria pulled Bob aside. "That was remarkable," she acknowledged. "How did you know exactly what to do?" Bob seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "Just experience, nothing special." "No," Victoria shook her head. "That wasn't just experience. You knew that engine intimately. You understood the modified thrust vectoring system better than my own engineers." Before Bob could respond, his sleeve caught on a protruding bolt, pulling back to reveal a portion of his forearm. Victoria's eyes widened at what she saw there, not the typical tattoo she might have expected, but an intricate schematic etched permanently into his skin. It wasn't decorative at all. The partially visible tattoo was an engineering diagram, one she recognized instantly as the cross-sectional design of an advanced turbofan engine with thrust vectoring capabilities, complete with annotation markers and flow dynamics calculations. Not the kind of image one gets on impulse or for aesthetic reasons. It was the mark of someone who lived and breathed aerospace engineering at the highest level. "That tattoo," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "Where did you get it?" Bob stiffened quickly, adjusting his sleeve to cover the design. "A reminder of another life," he replied, his tone making it clear he considered the subject closed. But Victoria Morgan hadn't built an aerospace empire by respecting conversational boundaries. She stepped closer, corporate protocol forgotten in her sudden need to understand. "That's the original GE9X vectoring concept, the proprietary version that never went into full production." Her eyes narrowed. Only 15 engineers worldwide had access to those specifications. Something shifted in Bob's expression. Resignation mixed with a flicker of the man he'd once been. 16, he corrected quietly. "I led the team that designed the modification." Victoria's mind raced, connecting impossible dots. That was GE's classified project with his Air Force. The Adaptive Thrust System. Recognition dawned fully. Robert Callahan, Dr. Robert Callahan, the propulsion systems pioneer. Bob glanced around to ensure they were alone before responding. "That was a long time ago. You disappeared from the industry 5 years ago. There were rumors of a government project gone wrong or corporate espionage or—" "My wife died," he interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of a hangar door closing. "Brain cancer. No warning. One day Sarah was helping our son with homework. The next day I was planning a funeral and becoming a single parent overnight." The stark simplicity of his explanation struck Victoria silent. In her world of corporate machinations and strategic career moves, she'd imagined elaborate professional conspiracies behind his disappearance, not profound personal tragedy. "Michael was 12, he continued, something compelling him to explain after years of silence. "He needed stability more than I needed achievement. So I chose him. Sold our house in Virginia, cashed out my patents, moved somewhere quiet where my salary wasn't tied to 100-hour work weeks in international travel. As he spoke, Victoria noticed a small photograph peeking from his wallet on the workbench. A smiling teenager with his father's thoughtful eyes and determined chin, the same eyes that had assessed the complex engine with such natural authority. The revelation rewrote everything she thought she understood about the man standing before her. Not an overconfident small-town mechanic, but one of the most brilliant aerospace engineers of his generation who had walked away from fame and fortune to become something more important, a present father. Victoria Richards, who had built her life on professional achievement at all costs, found herself facing a man who had made the opposite choice. And suddenly, uncomfortably, she wasn't certain which of them had chosen correctly. The 787's engine hummed perfectly during its final test, disappearing into the night sky as the pilot conducted a brief flight check. Victoria stood on the tarmac watching the navigation lights fade into the distance, her mind not on tomorrow's demonstration, but on the man whose existence had upended her carefully constructed worldview. She pulled out her phone and opened her browser. A quick search confirmed everything: Dr. Robert J. Callahan, MIT doctorate, at 28 key patents in advanced propulsion systems, recipient of the Aerospace Engineering Medal of Excellence. Article after article from 5 years prior questioned his sudden departure from General Electric, with speculation ranging from burnout to classified government projects. None mentioned the truth: a widower choosing fatherhood over professional legacy. The last photograph she found showed a younger, clean-shaven Bob in a pressed suit accepting an award at an international symposium. His expression held the confident assurance of someone who knew his worth and his place in the world, the same expression she practiced in her mirror each morning. Victoria closed the browser, uncomfortable with her invasive research, yet unable to reconcile the brilliant engineer with the man in worn coveralls who now tuned engines in a local garage. Had he truly found peace in this small-town existence? Or was his expertise slowly withering, a criminal waste of exceptional talent? As she walked back toward the hangar, Victoria confronted a more disturbing question. What did Bob Callahan's choices reveal about her own? She had sacrificed relationships, free time, and personal connections in service to Westfield's growth. Her father's approval, still sought years after his death, had been her North Star. Yet today she'd witnessed a man who had walked away from professional acclaim that even she could only aspire to. And he'd done it without apparent regret. Inside the hangar, Bob was packing his tools, his movements methodical and practiced. He'd already declined Victoria's offer of payment, suggesting instead a donation to Riverdale High School's engineering program. "Dr. Callahan," she said, approaching him. He looked up, a wry smile touching his lips. "Just Bob is fine. I haven't used the title in years." "I owe you an apology," Victoria said directly. "I made assumptions based on appearances. It was unprofessional and unkind." Bob seemed surprised by the admission. "Apology accepted. I'd like to offer you a position at Westfield," Victoria continued, "as a senior consulting engineer. Your expertise would be invaluable, especially as we expand our military contracts." Bob closed his tool case carefully. "I appreciate the offer, Ms. Richards, but I'm not interested in returning to corporate life. My priorities are different now." "I understand that," Victoria pressed on, "but surely there's a middle ground. Your talents are being wasted changing oil and fixing transmissions." For the first time, a flash of genuine annoyance crossed Bob's face. "Nothing that helps people is a waste, Ms. Richards. Those simple repairs keep my neighbors safe on the road. They get people to work, to doctor's appointments, to their kids' ball games." He shouldered his tool bag. "Not everyone measures value by the size of the project or the prestige of the title." Victoria recognized the rebuke for what it was: not just professional, but personal. A challenge to values she'd held unquestioned for decades. "Perhaps you're right," she admitted, surprising both of them. "Still, if you ever change your mind—" Bob nodded, his expression softening. "Your engine will perform flawlessly tomorrow. The algorithm adjustments we made should hold indefinitely, but I'd recommend a full review of the thrust vectoring system by your engineering team. The resonance issues will recur if they're not addressed at a fundamental level." "I'll make sure of it," Victoria promised. "And Ma, thank you, truly." As Bob walked toward the hangar door, Victoria called after him. "Would you and your son like to attend the demonstration tomorrow? The military brass would probably appreciate meeting the man who saved the show. Bob turned back, considering. Michael would enjoy that. He's been interested in aerospace engineering since he was little. Takes after his old man, I'm afraid. The invitation includes a tour of the aircraft afterward, Victoria added. 0830 if you're interested. For the first time, Bob smiled fully, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. We'll be there. Watching him leave, Victoria felt something shift in her perception, not just of Robert Callahan, but of success itself. For 20 years, she'd defined achievement exclusively through corporate advancement and technological innovation. Today, she'd encountered a different measure, the quiet dignity of a brilliant man who had chosen family over fame, presence over prestige. Tomorrow's demonstration would determine Westfield's military contract future. But tonight, Victoria Richards found herself contemplating a more personal question. What legacy would truly matter in the end? The following morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect conditions for a flight demonstration. Victoria arrived at Hangar 3 at 0630, determined to personally verify every aspect of the upcoming presentation. The repaired 787 gleamed under the hangar lights, its dark blue fuselage bearing the Westfield logo like a badge of honor. Her team had arrived from Seattle at 0300, exhausted but eager to examine the modifications made to the engine. Victoria had watched with quiet amusement as her lead engineers puzzled over the elegant solutions implemented by Bob Callahan, their expressions shifting from skepticism to reluctant admiration. These algorithm adjustments are remarkable, Westfield's chief engineer, Dr. Alan Phillips, admitted. They address the harmonic issue in a way we hadn't considered. Who did you say implemented this? A local consultant? Victoria replied neutrally. I'll introduce you later. Now, as military officials began arriving, Victoria found herself scanning the parking area for signs of Bob's old Ford pickup. The demonstration would begin in less than an hour, and despite her confidence in yesterday's repairs, she felt strangely incomplete without Bob's presence. Ms. Richards, Colonel Harris approached, hand extended. My team is looking forward to the demonstration. I understand there was some excitement yesterday with the engine. A minor technical adjustment, Victoria replied smoothly. Nothing our team couldn't handle. That's not what I heard, the colonel said with a knowing smile. Word is you brought in some kind of engine whisperer, old Air Force guy. Victoria maintained her professional composure. We utilized all available resources to ensure today's demonstration meets the Pentagon's expectations. Smart move, Harris nodded. Sometimes the old-timers know tricks the computer jockeys haven't learned yet. Before Victoria could respond, a murmur rippled through the gathered technicians. She turned to see Bob and Michael walking across the tarmac, both dressed more formally than she'd expected. Bob wore a clean button-down shirt and khaki pants instead of his usual coveralls, while Michael was neat in a blazer that slightly strained across his shoulders, suggesting it was his only one and perhaps a bit outgrown. What caught Victoria's attention, however, was the way several of the older military officials straightened when they saw Bob, a few even nudging their colleagues and pointing. Clearly, Dr. Robert Callahan wasn't as forgotten in aerospace circles as his current lifestyle might suggest. Dr. Callahan, one of the Air Force representatives, called breaking away from his group. Is that you, Colonel Frank Westmoreland? We met at Edwards in '08 during the advanced propulsion trials. Bob smiled, extending his hand. Frank, good to see you. How's that F-22 program treating you? Retired now like half the men here. Westmoreland, consulting for the Pentagon on this acquisition. Never thought I'd see you again after you disappeared. Industry lost a giant when you left. Victoria watched this exchange with growing amazement. Within minutes, Bob was surrounded by current and former military engineers, all eager to reconnect with the legendary propulsion expert they'd thought lost to the industry. Michael stood slightly apart, clearly proud but unsurprised by his father's reception. Victoria approached him, extending her hand. Victoria Richards, Westfield Aerospace. You must be Michael. The teenager shook her hand with surprising firmness. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for inviting us to the demonstration. His politeness and self-assurance spoke of careful parenting, a young man raised to look adults in the eye and speak with confidence. Your father made quite an impression yesterday, Victoria said. He essentially saved this demonstration. Michael nodded. Dad can fix anything. He doesn't make a big deal about it, but I've seen him rebuild systems most people would scrap. Has he taught you much about engineering? Victoria asked, genuinely curious about this father-son dynamic. The young man's face lit up. Everything. We have a workshop in the basement. Built my first turbine model when I was 13. Small one, just a demonstration unit, but it worked. And is aerospace engineering in your future plans? Yes, ma'am. Applied to MIT, Georgia Tech, and Purdue. Michael hesitated. Dad says I should make my own path, but honestly, I've wanted to design engines since I was little. Victoria found herself warming to this earnest young man. Your father made significant contributions to the field. Those designs are still fundamental to what we're doing today. I know, Michael said simply. He never talks about it much, but I've read all his papers. Have them downloaded on my laptop. Before Victoria could respond, the demonstration coordinator approached, signaling it was time to begin. She excused herself, moving to the front of the assembled group to deliver her opening remarks. The presentation proceeded flawlessly. The 787 performed exactly as promised, its modified engines demonstrating the increased maneuverability and reduced heat signature that made it attractive for military applications. The crowd of officials and engineers watched appreciatively as the aircraft executed precision turns that would have been impossible with standard commercial engines. Victoria delivered her technical briefing with practiced precision, highlighting the proprietary technologies that set Westfield apart from competitors. Throughout her presentation, she found her gaze repeatedly drawn to Bob and Michael standing among the observers. Unlike the other spectators, Bob wasn't watching the aircraft. He was watching his son, noting every reaction, every moment of excitement as Michael tracked the 787's demonstration maneuvers. The pride and love in that gaze was so naked, so unguarded, that Victoria found herself looking away, feeling like an intruder on something deeply personal. When the aircraft returned to the hangar and the formal presentation concluded, the procurement team huddled with Victoria's executives to discuss next steps. The consensus was clear. Westfield had impressed the Pentagon representatives. The contract discussions would move forward. As the crowd dispersed, Victoria sought out Bob and Michael. What did you think? She asked, addressing Michael first. The thrust vectoring was incredible, the teenager replied enthusiastically. The response time between control input and thrust redirection is better than anything I've seen documented. Victoria smiled, impressed by his technical observation. That's precisely what sets our system apart. The algorithms reduce lag by nearly 40% compared to competitors. You've solved the heat dissipation issues from the original design. Bob noted his first comment on the technical aspects of the demonstration. The exhaust pattern shows more efficient combustion than the prototype systems. Yes, though not without challenges, Victoria admitted. As you saw yesterday, nothing worth building comes easy. Bob replied, his expression softening as he looked at his son. Michael has been peppering me with questions about how you'd overcome the thrust-to-weight limitations of the original design. I'd be happy to show you both some of the technical specifications. Victoria offered, surprising herself with the suggestion. Westfield's modified engine designs were closely guarded intellectual property rarely shown to outsiders. Michael's eyes widened. Seriously, that would be amazing. Follow me, Victoria said, leading them toward a restricted area of the hangar where detailed schematics were displayed on large monitors. She swiped her security badge, granting them access to the engineering section. Inside, Westfield's technical team was reviewing data from the demonstration flight. Dr. Phillips looked up in surprise as Victoria entered with two strangers. Alan, I'd like you to meet Dr. Robert Callahan and his son, Michael. The chief engineer's jaw literally dropped. Dr. Robert Callahan, the Robert Callahan creator of the adaptive thrust vectoring system. Bob extended his hand with a self-deprecating smile. Just Bob these days. I understand you've made significant improvements to the original concept. Phillips grasped Bob's hand with obvious reverence. Your work was the foundation for everything we've developed. I studied your papers at Stanford. The mathematics behind your flow dynamics models were revolutionary. As the engineers fell into deep technical discussion, Victoria watched the interaction with growing interest. Bob, despite his initial reluctance, was clearly in his element, discussing complex engineering principles with peers who understood and valued his expertise. The small-town mechanic persona had fallen away, entirely replaced by the brilliant engineer he'd once been, and clearly still was. More striking was how he consistently included Michael in the conversation, explaining concepts when necessary but never talking down to him. The teenager absorbed everything, asking occasional questions that revealed a deep understanding of the principles being discussed. After nearly an hour of technical exchange, Bob glanced at his watch. "Michael, we should head out. You've got that calculus test to study for." The teenager nodded reluctantly, clearly wishing they could stay longer. "Before you go," Victoria interjected, "I'd like to show you one more thing, something I think might interest you both." She led them to a secured area at the rear of the hangar where a tarp covered what appeared to be a large piece of equipment. With a nod to the security officer, Victoria pulled back the covering to reveal an experimental engine unlike anything currently in production. "This is our next-generation prototype," she explained, the XGT-5. It incorporates a hybrid propulsion system that reduces fuel consumption by 30% while maintaining thrust capabilities comparable to current military standards. Bob's expression showed genuine interest as he circled the engine, his experienced eyes taking in details that most would miss. "Interesting approach to the compressor design. You've modified the blade geometry to reduce turbulence." "Yes, but we're encountering efficiency issues at high altitudes," Victoria admitted. "The system doesn't maintain optimal compression above 45,000 feet. Bob nodded thoughtfully, then pointed to a specific section of the engine. "Your issue might be here. The pressure differential across these stages is creating flow separation under low atmospheric density." Victoria and Dr. Phillips exchanged glances. This was precisely the problem they'd been struggling with for months. "We've run hundreds of simulations trying to address that," Phillips said. "Simulations have limitations," Bob replied. "They model what you tell them to model. Sometimes you need to get your hands dirty to understand what's really happening." Michael, who had been examining the engine's electronic control unit, spoke up unexpectedly. "What if you introduced a variable geometry system in the intermediate compressor stages, adjust the stator vanes based on altitude and air density?" The room fell silent as three experienced aerospace engineers turned to stare at the 17-year-old. Bob's face broke into a proud smile. "That's actually a solid approach, similar to what we implemented on the GE F-110 variants, but applied to the civilian architecture." Phillips looked at Michael with new respect. "Young man, have you considered internships during your college years? Westfield has an excellent program for engineering students." Before Michael could respond, Bob placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let him get through high school first. Plenty of time for career decisions later." The protectiveness in that simple gesture spoke volumes. For all his obvious pride in his son's abilities, Bob was determined to let Michael develop at his own pace without the pressure of accelerated advancement. As they prepared to leave, Victoria walked them to the parking area. "Thank you both for coming today. Your insights were unexpected but valuable." Bob nodded but seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on the prototype engine they'd just examined. Victoria recognized the look, the engineer's mind still working on a problem, turning it over, seeking solutions. "You have thoughts about the high-altitude compression issue," she observed. Bob hesitated, then nodded. "A few, nothing concrete." Victoria made a decision. "Would you be willing to consult on this project informally? On your terms, around your schedule?" "I don't think—" "Dad," Michael interrupted gently, "maybe you should consider it." Bob looked at his son in surprise. "You're still working through aerospace problems every night in the basement," Michael continued. "I see the notebooks, the calculations. You miss it, not the corporate stuff, but the actual engineering." Victoria watched this exchange with fascination, struck by the relationship dynamic. Despite his youth, Michael clearly understood his father in ways that suggested deep mutual respect. "Just think about it," Victoria said, handing Bob her business card. "No pressure, no corporate politics, just solving interesting problems." Bob took the card, his expression unreadable. "I'll consider it." As their truck pulled away, Victoria found herself genuinely hoping he would call. There was something refreshing about Bob Callahan's approach to engineering, a purity of focus on the technical challenges rather than career advancement or corporate positioning. Back in the hangar, Dr. Phillips approached her. Was that really the Robert Callahan? The man's a legend. His thrust vectoring patents revolutionized military aviation. How on earth did you find him? Victoria smiled slightly. He found us in a manner of speaking, or rather, our engine problems found him. And the boy, his son, yes, apparently following in his father's footsteps. Philip shook his head in amazement. If he has half his father's talent, we should be recruiting him already. That suggestion about the variable geometry system was inspired. Victoria nodded absently, her mind already formulating plans. Bob Callahan might have walked away from the aerospace industry, but his brilliance was undimmed. And while she respected his priorities, she couldn't help but see the potential benefit to both Westfield and Bob himself in finding a way to bring his expertise back into meaningful application. The question was how to structure an arrangement that would respect his commitment to his son while still engaging his obvious passion for engineering challenges. Tatum. 2 weeks passed without word from Bob. The Pentagon contract negotiations proceeded favorably with formal approval expected within the month. Victoria found herself unexpectedly disappointed by the silence, though she'd never admit as much to her team. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, her assistant interrupted a budget meeting with an urgent message. Ms. Richards, there's a Michael Callahan here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's insistent it's important. Victoria's surprise must have shown on her face. Send him in. Michael entered the conference room looking distinctly uncomfortable in the corporate environment. He carried a worn leather portfolio similar to the one Bob had brought to repair the engine. I apologize for interrupting Ms. Richards, he began formally, but I wanted to show you something my father's been working on. Victoria dismissed the other executives with a nod. Once they were alone, she gestured for Michael to take a seat. What's this about? Dad's been obsessing over your high-altitude compression problem, Michael explained, opening the portfolio. He won't admit it, but he's been working on it every night. I thought you should see this. He spread several hand-drawn schematics across the table, detailed engineering drawings of modified compressor stages, accompanied by pages of complex calculations. The work was meticulous, with the precision and attention to detail that characterized true engineering excellence. Victoria studied the designs with growing excitement. Bob had developed an entirely novel approach to the compression issue, one that Westfield's engineers hadn't considered. These are remarkable, she said finally. Why didn't your father bring these himself? Michael looked down, suddenly seeming every bit the teenager he was, rather than the confident young man she'd met at the demonstration. He doesn't know I'm here, he admitted. He'd probably be mad if he knew, but he hesitated. Miss Richards, my dad needs this. He won't say it, but he does. Needs what, exactly? The challenge, the purpose. Michael chose his words carefully. After Mom died, Dad poured everything into raising me. He gave up a career he loved to be there for me. And I'm grateful I am, but I'm heading to college next year, and then what? He'll be alone in that house fixing carburetors and oil leaks. The young man's concern for his father was palpable. He's too young to retire, too smart to waste his abilities. But he's also too stubborn to admit he misses the work. Victoria considered this unexpected situation. She'd been prepared to negotiate with Bob, but not to conspire with his son behind his back. Yet Michael's motivations seemed pure, genuine concern for his father's fulfillment rather than self-interest. What exactly are you suggesting, Michael? I don't know, he admitted. I just thought, if you saw what he was working on, maybe you could find a way to convince him it's worth pursuing, that he can contribute without sacrificing everything else. Victoria nodded slowly, an idea forming. I think I might have a solution, but I'll need your help. The small municipal airfield outside Riverdale primarily served private pilots in flight training schools. On this particular Saturday morning, however, the main hangar housed something far more sophisticated than the usual Cessnas and Pipers. Bob pulled his truck into the parking area, puzzled by Michael's insistence that he needed to see something at the airfield. His son had been unusually secretive all week, claiming it was related to his senior project, but offering no details. Inside the hangar, Bob stopped short. Parked in the center of the open space was a sleek business jet, a Cessna Citation X, with Westfield Aerospace's logo emblazoned on its tail. More surprising was the group waiting beside it: Michael, Victoria Richards, and Dr. Phillips from Westfield's engineering team. What's going on? Bob asked, immediately suspicious. Michael approached with an apologetic smile. Don't be mad, Dad, but I showed Ms. Richards your designs for the high-altitude compression system. Bob's expression darkened. You did what? They're brilliant, Bob, Victoria interjected, stepping forward. Genuinely innovative. We've already run preliminary simulations based on your schematics, and they indicate a 22% improvement in high-altitude efficiency. That wasn't Michael's place, Bob said stiffly. Those were private calculations not intended for— Dad, Michael interrupted gently. You've spent 5 years putting my needs first. Maybe it's time to think about what you need too. The simple statement seemed to take the wind out of Bob's sails. He looked at his son with a complex mixture of emotions, surprise, confusion, and something like grudging pride. Victoria seized the moment. We're not asking you to return to corporate life, Bob, but we are proposing something I think might interest you. She gestured to the Citation jet. This aircraft has been equipped with a prototype of the XGT-5 engine we showed you. We're conducting high-altitude testing over the next 6 months. The test program will be run from this airfield 20 minutes from your home. Bob's technical curiosity visibly warred with his reluctance. Why here Westfield has proper testing facilities? Because the lead engineer for this project insists on working close to home, Victoria replied smoothly. He has a son finishing his senior year, and he's not willing to commute to Seattle or compromise on being present for important milestones. Understanding dawned on Bob's face. You're offering me the project lead. 20 hours a week, mostly here, occasional trips to Seattle when necessary, which we'll schedule around Michael's activities, Victoria confirmed. Full access to Westfield's resources and simulation capabilities, but the autonomy to implement your designs without corporate interference. Phillips added, we've assembled a small team of engineers who would rotate through here to support the testing. All people who would consider it an honor to work with you. Bob looked at the jet, then back at his son, conflicting emotions playing across his face. Michael, we should discuss this privately. Actually, Michael said with unexpected firmness, I think this is my graduation present. Excuse me. You're always asking what I want for graduation. This is it. I want you to take this job, Dad. I want to see you building amazing engines again before I leave for college. Bob stared at his son, clearly caught off guard by this reversal of their usual dynamic, the child looking out for the parent rather than the other way around. Victoria, sensing the need for father and son to talk privately, motioned to Dr. Phillips. We'll give you some time to discuss this. We'll be outside when you're ready. Once outside, Phillips couldn't contain his excitement. Do you think he'll accept having Robert Callahan leading this project would be a massive coup for Westfield? I think he's considering it, Victoria replied carefully. But this isn't about Westfield's advantage. It's about the right solution for everyone involved. Phillips looked at her curiously. That's not your usual approach to recruitment, if you don't mind my saying so. Victoria smiled slightly. Perhaps I'm learning that there are different ways to measure success. After 20 minutes, the hangar door opened. Bob and Michael emerged, both wearing expressions that revealed little about their decision. If we're going to do this, Bob said without preamble, I have conditions. Victoria nodded. I expected nothing less. First, this remains part-time until Michael leaves for college. 20 hours a week, no more. And I keep my job at Miller's Garage. Agreed. Second, Michael gets a proper internship next summer. Not because he's my son, but because he's earned it. He works with the team, learns the systems, gets real experience before college. Victoria glanced at Michael, whose face had lit up at this unexpected condition. We'd be delighted to have him. Third, Bob continued, his expression softening slightly. We set up a scholarship program for Riverdale High. Engineering scholarships for students who can't afford college but have the aptitude. Westfield funds it, I help administer it. This final condition surprised Victoria. Not a personal benefit or advantage, but an investment in the community that had become his home. I think that can be arranged, she said. Anything else? Bob looked at the Citation jet, then back at Victoria. For the first time, a genuine smile spread across his face, not the reserved expression he typically wore, but something that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered features. When do we start? The next 3 months saw a transformation at Riverdale Municipal Airport. Hangar 5, previously used for storage, had been converted into a state-of-the-art testing facility. Advanced diagnostic equipment shared space with the Citation X test bed and a partial engine assembly rig where components could be modified and tested before installation. More significant was the transformation in Bob himself. While he maintained his hours at Miller's Auto Shop 3 days a week, his passion for the XGT5 project was evident to everyone involved. The reserved small-town mechanic had been replaced, or rather supplemented, by the brilliant aerospace engineer who attacked complex problems with methodical precision and creative insight. Victoria found herself traveling to Riverdale with increasing frequency, ostensibly to monitor the project's progress, but increasingly because she genuinely enjoyed the collaborative environment Bob had created. Unlike Westfield's formal corporate facilities, the Riverdale operation had developed its own unique culture. Engineers wore jeans and work shirts rather than business casual. Technical discussions happened over pizza and coffee rather than in conference rooms. Problems were solved collaboratively with Bob, encouraging input from every team member regardless of rank or experience. Most surprisingly, local high school students, including Michael and several of his classmates interested in engineering, were regular visitors observing tests and even contributing to basic components of the project under careful supervision. "This isn't standard protocol," Victoria observed one afternoon watching Bob explain turbine blade design principles to 3 rapt teenagers. "Neither is setting up a multi-million-dollar test facility in a town of 12,000 people," Bob replied with a smile. "But these kids are the future of engineering. Better they learn by doing than from textbooks alone." Victoria couldn't argue with the results. The XGT5 project was progressing ahead of schedule, with Bob's redesigned compression system showing even better performance than the simulations had predicted. More than that, the unconventional approach had attracted attention within Westfield. Engineers from other divisions were requesting temporary assignments to the Riverdale Skunk Works, as it had become known internally. The innovative environment was producing not just solutions to the XGT5's challenges, but spin-off ideas applicable to other Westfield projects. On a crisp October afternoon, Victoria arrived for the weekly progress review to find the hangar unusually quiet. Only Bob was present, working at a computer station surrounded by technical readouts. "Where is everyone?" she asked, setting down her briefcase. "Sent them home early," Bob replied without looking up. "Michael's school is hosting a college fair. Most of the team has kids attending." Victoria checked her watch. "Our meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m, and I emailed you the complete technical update at 2:30. Bob countered, finally looking up with an amused expression. "Sometimes people matter more than schedules, Victoria." The gentle rebuke might once have irritated her. Now, after months of working with Bob, she found herself nodding in agreement. "You're right, I'm sorry." Bob's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. Did Victoria Richards, CEO of Westfield Aerospace, just apologize for prioritizing business? Someone alert the media. Victoria laughed despite herself. Their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, with enough mutual respect to allow for occasional teasing. "I'm learning," she admitted, taking a seat beside him. "Slowly, perhaps, but learning nonetheless." "Speaking of learning," Bob said, closing the technical files on his screen, "I've been meaning to ask about the scholarship program. Is Westfield still on board?" "More than on board," Victoria replied. "The board approved funding for 10 full-ride engineering scholarships annually. 5 specifically for Riverdale students, 5 open to regional applicants." Bob's expression registered genuine surprise. "10, we discussed 3. The additional funding was my recommendation," Victoria said. "After seeing what you've built here, not just the technical work, but the community engagement, I believe it's a model worth expanding." For a moment, Bob seemed at a loss for words. Thank you. It will make a real difference for these kids." Victoria nodded unexpectedly, moved by his reaction. In her corporate world, millions of dollars changed hands with clinical detachment. Bob's genuine appreciation for the impact on individual students reminded her that business decisions affected real lives. "Actually," she continued, "that relates to something else I wanted to discuss. The board is very impressed with the Riverdale operation. They're interested in exploring similar regional development centers in other parts of the country." Bob leaned back in his chair, considering this. Decentralized R&D, that's a significant departure from Westfield's traditional approach. "Yes, but the results here speak for themselves. We're seeing innovation rates 40% higher than our centralized facilities, with 23% lower overhead costs." "Because people are happier," Bob said simply. They're working close to home, spending less time commuting, more time with their families. Happy engineers solve problems more creatively. That's exactly the point I made to the board, Victoria agreed. Which brings me to a proposition. We'd like you to help develop the framework for these regional centers. Share your approach consult on the implementation. Bob frowned slightly. That sounds suspiciously like a corporate position, Victoria. Consulting only, she clarified quickly. 2 days a month mainly to ensure that what makes this operation special isn't lost in translation. And the XGT5 project continues here with you as lead for as long as necessary. This would be additional, not replacement. Bob considered the offer thoughtfully. Let me think about it and discuss it with Michael. Victoria nodded, having expected this response. In the months they'd worked together, she'd come to understand that Bob Callahan made no significant professional decisions without considering their impact on his son. It was an approach to work-life balance that had initially seemed foreign to her but increasingly made sense. Of course, there's no rush. She paused, then added, how is Michael's college decision coming along? Bob's expression brightened. He's narrowed it to MIT and Georgia Tech. Both have offered him scholarships, though not full rides. He's a remarkable young man, Victoria said sincerely. Westfield would be fortunate to have him join us after graduation should he be interested. One step at a time, Bob replied, the protective father evident in his tone. He needs to experience college without the pressure of predetermined career paths. Victoria nodded, understanding his perspective. Of course, but the door is open whenever he's ready. As they wrapped up their impromptu meeting, Victoria found herself reluctant to leave. The Riverdale facility, with its unpretentious atmosphere and focus on practical problem-solving, had become something of a refuge from the political complexities of Westfield's corporate headquarters. Would you like to join us for dinner? Bob asked unexpectedly as they walked to the parking area. Nothing fancy. Michael's making his famous lasagna. The kid's a better cook than I ever was. Victoria hesitated, surprised by the invitation. Their relationship had evolved professionally, but this represented a crossing of boundaries into personal territory. I wouldn't want to intrude on your family time, she said carefully. Bob smiled. If you haven't noticed, this project has made our garage team part of the extended family. Half of them have had dinner at our place at some point. Besides, Michael's been asking questions about corporate governance structures that I can't answer with any authority. The simple, genuine nature of the invitation made it difficult to decline. And if she was honest with herself, Victoria was curious about their home life, the environment that had produced both the brilliant engineer she'd come to respect and the impressive young man Michael was becoming. I'd like that, she said finally. Thank you. Following Bob's truck through the streets of Riverdale, Victoria was struck by how different this small town was from the urban environments she typically inhabited. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks. Neighbors waved to each other from porches. The pace felt deliberately slower, as if the community had collectively decided that some things were worth taking time for. Bob's house was exactly as she'd imagined, modest but impeccably maintained, with the gleaming Corvette Stingray still holding pride of place in the driveway. The interior revealed a home that was lived in rather than showcased. Bookshelves overflowed with technical manuals and science fiction novels. A half-completed model aircraft occupied one corner of the living room. Family photos, primarily of Michael at various ages, often with Bob beside him, lined the hallway. Dad? Was that you? Michael called from the kitchen, the aroma of Italian spices filling the house. Got company for dinner, Bob replied, hanging his jacket on a hook by the door. Ms. Richards accepted our invitation. Michael appeared in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. Ms. Richards, welcomes to our home. I hope you like lasagna. Please call me Victoria, she replied, feeling strangely formal in this casual setting. And lasagna sounds wonderful. Dinner proved to be a revelation. The conversation flowed easily between technical discussions of the XGT5 project, Michael's college applications, and Bob's stories of past engineering challenges. Victoria found herself laughing more than she had in months, particularly at Bob's self-deprecating accounts of aerospace experiments gone wrong. So there we were, he recounted, 3 PhDs and 2 Air Force colonels staring at this prototype engine that's just ejected its exhaust manifold across the test cell. Complete silence until Colonel Wilson says, Gentlemen, I believe that qualifies as an uncontained failure. Understatement of the century. As Michael cleared the dishes, insisting that guests weren't allowed to help, Victoria noticed a photograph she hadn't seen before. Unlike the others displayed throughout the house, this one sat on a small side table partially obscured by books. It showed a beautiful woman with Michael's smile, her arm around a much younger Bob, both of them laughing on what appeared to be a hiking trail. Sarah, Bob said quietly, noticing her gaze. Michael's mother, taken about a year before her diagnosis. Victoria looked at the image of the woman whose absence had so profoundly shaped the lives of both Callahan men. She was beautiful. She was brilliant, Bob corrected gently. Environmental scientist, could identify every plant species in the Appalachian Range. Taught at the university until Michael was born, then consulted part-time so she could be home with him. There was no bitterness in his voice as he spoke of his late wife, only a deep respect and lingering affection that time hadn't diminished. She sounds remarkable, Victoria said. Bob nodded, his eyes on the photograph. She was the one who insisted I take the GE position, even though it meant moving across country. Said my designs could help make air travel more efficient, reduce emissions, change the world one engine at a time, she used to say. The insight into Bob's motivation shifted Victoria's understanding of him. His engineering brilliance wasn't driven solely by technical fascination, but by a desire to create meaningful impact, a value that his wife had clearly shared and reinforced. I think she'd be proud, Victoria said carefully, of what you've built here, of Michael. I hope so, Bob replied, his expression softening. That's all that really matters in the end, isn't it? Not the patents or the professional recognition, but whether you've lived up to the expectations of the people who truly know you. The simple statement struck Victoria with unexpected force. In her career-focused life, professional accomplishments had always been the primary measure of success. The idea that true validation might come instead from personal relationships, from being known and respected by those closest to you, was both foreign and strangely compelling. As the evening wound down, Victoria found herself reluctant to leave this warm, unpretentious home. The contrast with her own sleek but sterile penthouse apartment was stark and uncomfortably revealing. Thank you for dinner, she said as Bob walked her to her car. It was lovely. Michael's a great cook, Bob replied with paternal pride. Gets that from his mother. My culinary expertise ends at grilled cheese sandwiches. Victoria smiled, then hesitated, a question forming that she'd been curious about for months. Bob, may I ask you something personal? You can ask, can't promise I'll answer. Are you ever sorry about leaving aerospace, I mean? You could have continued your work, made arrangements for Michael. Many single parents manage careers in childcare. Bob considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Sorry, no. Sad sometimes, missing the challenges, the camaraderie. But not sorry. He looked back at the house lights glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. I had to make a choice, Victoria, and every time I see my son, the person he's becoming, I know it was the right one. He studied her expression for a moment. Why do you ask? Victoria found herself uncharacteristically hesitant. I suppose I'm trying to understand different definitions of success, different paths. Bob nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think we need both kinds of people in this world. Those who drive forward professionally at all costs, pushing boundaries, and those who focus on smaller circles of influence, deeper connections. And which am I? Victoria asked, surprised by her own vulnerability. Bob smiled, his eyes kind. Right now, someone asking important questions. That's usually a good sign. As Victoria drove back to her hotel, the conversation lingered in her mind. For 20 years, she'd pursued professional excellence with singular focus, measuring success in contracts secured and innovations delivered. Her father's voice had been her constant companion. Westfield accepts nothing less than excellence. Yet here was Bob Callahan, a man of undeniable brilliance who had deliberately stepped away from professional acclaim to prioritize his son. A man who seemed more at peace, more genuinely content than most of the high-achieving executives in her circle. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Richards found herself questioning whether she had been measuring success by the right metrics all along. The crisis came without warning on a Tuesday morning in December. Victoria was reviewing quarterly projections when her operations director burst into her office without knocking, an unprecedented breach of protocol that immediately signaled the severity of the situation. The XGT-5 test aircraft crashed during high-altitude testing, he reported breathlessly. Over the mountains near Riverdale. Victoria felt her stomach drop. Casualties. No injuries. Test pilot ejected safely, but the aircraft is a total loss and preliminary data suggests catastrophic engine failure. Bob, she asked immediately. Dr. Callahan was in the control center. He's fine. But Ms. Richards, the Pentagon evaluation team was monitoring this test flight. They're already talking about withdrawing from contract discussions. Victoria grabbed her coat. Have my helicopter ready in 15 minutes and get me a direct line to Bob Callahan. The flight to Riverdale took 40 agonizing minutes. By the time Victoria's helicopter touched down at the municipal airport, the situation had deteriorated further. Pentagon officials had arrived on site and were demanding explanations for the failure. Media outlets were reporting on the crash, speculating about design flaws in Westfield's next-generation engine. The atmosphere in Hangar 5 was tense. Military officers in uniform stood in one corner, speaking in hushed tones. Westfield engineers huddled around computer stations analyzing data streams. And in the center of it all stood Bob Callahan, his face grave, as he studied readouts from the crashed aircraft's final moments. Bob, Victoria called, striding across the hangar. Status report. He looked up, relief briefly crossing his features before returning to professional focus. Engine failure at 42,000 feet during maximum thrust testing. Turbine disintegration followed by compressor failure. Because also, still analyzing but preliminary data suggests material failure in the high-pressure turbine section. The titanium alloy didn't perform as expected under the temperature and stress conditions. Victoria processed this information rapidly. Where's the Pentagon team? Colonel Harris and his technical leads are reviewing the telemetry data in the conference room. They're not happy. Understandable. Their test pilot just had to eject from a failing aircraft. Victoria squared her shoulders. I need to speak with them immediately. Bob caught her arm gently. Victoria, wait. There's something you need to know first. His serious expression gave her pause. What is it? The material failure been issued. It wasn't in our original design specs. It appears someone in production substituted a less expensive alloy than what we specified for the turbine components. Victoria felt cold anger rising. Are you certain? I've pulled the original material specifications and compared them to the batch records. The turbine blades were manufactured using a titanium alloy with 2% less molybdenum than required. It reduced the high-temperature stability by nearly 200 degrees. Cost-cutting, Victoria said flatly. Someone trying to improve margins without understanding the engineering implications. Bob nodded grimly. The question is, do we present this to the Pentagon now, or wait until we have conclusive metallurgical analysis from the recovered components? It was a critical decision. Admitting a production error rather than a design flaw might preserve the Pentagon's confidence in the fundamental engine concept. But making accusations without absolute proof risked appearing defensive or evasive. Victoria considered her options carefully. Throughout her career, she'd built her reputation on uncompromising standards and transparent communication principles her father had instilled in her from childhood. We tell them everything, she decided. Show them the specification documents. The batch records are preliminary analysis. Full transparency. Bob studied her face. That's going to trigger an internal investigation. Someone's career will likely end over this. As it should, Victoria replied firmly. This isn't about protecting individuals, Bob. It's about Westfield's integrity and the safety of the pilots who fly our aircraft. His expression showed approval, perhaps even respect. I've prepared the technical briefing. You want to lead on this? Victoria nodded, squaring her shoulders. You handle the engineering explanation. I'll address the accountability aspects. The meeting with the Pentagon team was tense but productive. Colonel Harris himself, a former test pilot, appreciated the direct approach. The production discrepancy was clearly documented, with Bob's technical explanation providing a convincing case that the design itself remained sound. We'll need to see a successful test with properly manufactured components before we can proceed with contract discussions, Harris concluded, and a full report on the quality control failures that allowed this to happen. You'll have both, Victoria promised. I'll personally oversee the investigation and corrective actions. After the military officials departed, Victoria turned to the grim task of identifying how such a critical error had occurred. The production records led back to Westfield's Seattle facility, where a mid-level manager had apparently authorized the materials substitution to reduce costs during a budget crunch. "I need to return to headquarters immediately," she told Bob after reviewing the documentation. "This goes beyond just the XGT-5 project. We need to verify that similar substitutions haven't occurred in other programs." Bob nodded, his expression grave. "I understand. What do you need from us here?" "Continue the failure analysis. Prepare a redesign using the correct materials. And," she hesitated, "be prepared for increased scrutiny. This incident will draw attention from regulators, media, possibly even shareholders." "We'll handle it," Bob assured her. "The team here is solid. They understand what's at stake." As Victoria prepared to leave, Bob walked her to the helicopter. The December wind whipped across the airfield, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. "Victoria," Bob said quietly, "for what it's worth, I think you are handling this exactly right. Many executives would be looking for ways to deflect blame or minimize the issue." "That's not how I operate," she replied simply. "I know. It's why this partnership works." He studied her face for a moment. "You're going to take some heat for this. Corporate boards don't like public admissions of failure." Victoria smiled grimly. "Let them try to overrule me. Westfield was built on integrity. I won't compromise that, not even to protect our stock price." Bob nodded, his respect evident. "If you need technical backup during the investigation, call me, day or night." "I will," she promised, then hesitated. "How's Michael taking all this? He must be concerned about the project." "He's disappointed but philosophical. Said something that surprised me, actually. 'Dad, the most important engineering lessons come from failures, not successes.'" Victoria smiled. "Smart young man." "Gets that from his mother," Bob replied with a hint of his usual humor. Then more seriously, "Be careful, Victoria. Corporate politics can get ugly when careers are on the line." She nodded, touched by his concern. "I've weathered worse storms. This won't be my first crisis management rodeo." As her helicopter lifted off, Victoria looked down at the small figure of Bob Callahan, standing on the tarmac watching her departure. In just a few months, this unlikely partnership had evolved from professional skepticism to mutual respect to something approaching genuine friendship. More than that, Bob's influence had subtly shifted her perspective on leadership itself, from driving relentlessly forward to balancing progress with people, from demanding excellence to nurturing it through trust and collaboration. Now facing what might be the most significant crisis of her career, Victoria found herself drawing strength from his example. The integrity to acknowledge mistakes, the courage to face consequences, and the wisdom to value people above position. The storm ahead would test Westfield's corporate culture and Victoria's leadership. But for perhaps the first time in her professional life, she felt grounded in values that transcended quarterly results and shareholder expectations. Whatever came next, she would face it with clear eyes and an uncompromising commitment to doing what was right, not just what was expedient. The investigation would be thorough, the consequences appropriate, and the lessons implemented. That was the only acceptable path forward, regardless of the personal cost. As Seattle's skyline came into view, Victoria straightened her shoulders and prepared for battle. The coming weeks would reveal much about Westfield's character as a company and her own as its leader. The Westfield Aerospace Board meeting was as contentious as Victoria had anticipated. Gathered around the polished mahogany table in the top floor conference room, the 12 board members, mostly men in their 60s and 70s, listened with growing concern as she outlined the XGT-5 engine failure and its causes. "Let me be clear," Victoria concluded, standing at the head of the table with perfect posture, despite having slept only 3 hours. "This was not a design flaw. This was a deliberate deviation from engineering specifications to reduce costs. My investigation has identified the individuals responsible, and I've suspended them pending final review." Harold Whitmore, the 72-year-old chairman of the board, leaned forward. "Victoria, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I'm concerned about the public approach you're advocating. Wouldn't it be more prudent to handle this internally without explicit acknowledgement of the irregularities?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "No, Mr. Chairman, it would not. The Pentagon already knows the cause of the failure. Attempting to obscure or downplay it would only damage our credibility further. The stock has already dropped 8%, noted Margaret Chen, the only other woman on the board. A public admission of quality control failures could trigger a much steeper decline. I'm more concerned with the long-term consequences of compromising our integrity, Victoria countered. Westfield was built on engineering excellence and uncompromising standards. That's our true value proposition, not quarterly fluctuations in stock price. Several board members exchanged glances. Victoria's approach, while ethically sound, represented a financial risk they were clearly uncomfortable with. Perhaps, suggested Thomas Reynolds, former CFO of a major defense contractor, we could frame this as an unexpected material performance issue rather than an outright substitution, technical enough to satisfy disclosure requirements without admitting to a quality control breakdown. Victoria's expression hardened. Gentlemen and Ms. Chen, let me be perfectly clear. I will not authorize any communication that obscures the truth. The materials were incorrectly substituted against engineering specifications. That's what happened, and that's what we will acknowledge. She placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. My father founded this company on the principle that we would never ever compromise safety for profit. I don't intend to abandon that principle on my watch. The invocation of Richard Richards, Westfield's revered founder, created a momentary silence. Many of the older board members had worked with him directly and respected his unwavering commitment to quality. What about the Riverdale operation? Asked Chen, changing tack. This experimental approach to R&D clearly hasn't yielded the results we hoped for. Victoria shook her head firmly. The Riverdale team is not at fault. In fact, Dr. Callahan's group identified the material discrepancy within hours of the failure, something our Seattle quality control processes should have caught months ago. If anything, this incident validates the value of having experienced engineers with hands-on involvement in every stage of development. Ah, yes, the mysterious Dr. Callahan, Whitmore said, a hint of skepticism in his tone. A garage mechanic you discovered in some small town who turned out to be a lost genius. It sounds like a Hallmark movie, Victoria. Several board members chuckled, but Victoria didn't smile. Dr. Robert Callahan was the lead designer of the GE Adaptive Thrust Vectoring System that forms the foundation of our military engine program. His patents generate millions in licensing revenue annually. The fact that he chose family over career advancement doesn't diminish his expertise. If anything, it speaks to his character. Victoria distributed a folder to each board member. This contains my full report on the incident, including corrective actions already implemented and a timeline for redesign and retesting. You'll also find a comprehensive reform of our quality control processes to prevent similar occurrences in the future. She paused, making eye contact with each person around the table. I'm not asking for your approval of these measures. As CEO, quality control falls within my operational authority. I'm informing you of actions already taken and planned. The assertion of executive authority created another ripple of discomfort around the table. Victoria had always been a strong leader, but this level of directness was unusual even for her. And if the Pentagon cancels the contract, asked Reynolds, the shareholders will demand accountability, Victoria. The board may need to consider leadership changes if this situation deteriorates further. The implied threat hung in the air. Victoria had expected this, the inevitable suggestion that her position might be at risk if she didn't fall in line with more traditional damage control approaches. Mr. Reynolds, she replied evenly, if the Pentagon loses confidence in Westfield because we tell them the truth about a quality control failure, then we have bigger problems than one contract. Our entire business model relies on trust. Once that's compromised, no clever PR strategy will save us. She gathered her materials, signaling that she considered the discussion concluded. I'll be meeting with the Pentagon procurement team tomorrow morning. Dr. Callahan is flying in to provide technical support for the presentation. I expect we'll have preliminary feedback on their position by close of business tomorrow. As the board members filed out, Whitmore remained seated, gesturing for Victoria to stay behind. When they were alone, the older man studied her with a mixture of concern and grudging respect. You're taking a significant personal risk with this approach, Victoria. The board won't protect you if this goes sideways. Victoria nodded. I understand that, Harold. Your father would be proud, he added unexpectedly. He was just as stubborn about doing things the right way, even when it cost him. Thank you, Victoria said, genuinely touched by the comparison. That said, Whitmore continued, he also knew when to be politically astute. This Callahan fellow, is he really worth the capital you're spending on him? The board sees this Riverdale operation as your pet project, a distraction from core business. Victoria considered her response carefully. Dr. Callahan represents something Westfield has been missing: engineering leadership that prioritizes integrity and innovation over corporate advancement. His team has produced more practical innovations in 6 months than our main R&D division has in 2 years. Because you've given them freedom from standard protocols, Whitmore pointed out. Because they're motivated by the work itself, not organizational politics, Victoria countered. Harold, we've become so focused on processes and procedures that we've lost sight of why we build aircraft in the first place: the joy of solving impossible problems, of creating something that changes how people move through the world. Whitmore looked surprised by her passion. That doesn't sound like the Victoria Richards who's been driving Westfield's growth for the past decade. Victoria smiled slightly. Perhaps I'm evolving. Good leaders should. As she left the boardroom, Victoria felt a curious sense of liberation. For years, she'd navigated corporate politics with calculated precision, always weighing each decision against potential internal repercussions. Today, she'd chosen a different path, one guided by principles rather than expediency. It felt right, even with the professional risk, and she knew exactly who had influenced this shift in her approach. Bob Callahan looked distinctly uncomfortable in the formal surroundings of Westfield's corporate headquarters. Despite wearing what was clearly his best suit, slightly dated but well-maintained, he seemed out of place among the sleek modern architecture and the executives in designer businesswear. Victoria met him in the lobby, extending her hand with genuine warmth. Thank you for coming, Bob. I know corporate settings aren't your favorite environment. That's putting it mildly, he replied with a wry smile, shaking her hand. Michael insisted I get a haircut for the occasion, said I couldn't meet the Pentagon looking like, and I quote, a mountain man who fixes engines. Victoria laughed, noticing that his usually shaggy gray hair was indeed neatly trimmed. How is he recovering from the disappointment of the test failure? Already focused on solutions. He's been helping me run simulations on the redesigned components. Bob's pride was evident. That boy has a gift for spotting potential failure points before they become problems. They walked together toward the conference room where the Pentagon team waited. Victoria briefed Bob on the board meeting and the potential consequences they faced. So basically, Bob summarized, your job could be on the line because you refuse to sugarcoat a quality control failure. That's the essence of it, yes. Bob shook his head. Corporate politics. This is why I stayed in the lab as long as possible at GE. The further you get from the actual engineering, the more it becomes about managing perceptions rather than solving problems. Sometimes managing perceptions is part of the job, Victoria acknowledged, but not at the expense of integrity. They paused outside the conference room door. Bob studied her face with unexpected intensity. You've changed since we first met, he observed. The CEO who showed up at that hangar in Riverdale would have had her PR team crafting careful messaging before admitting to any error. Victoria considered this assessment. Perhaps I needed a reminder of what Westfield was founded to be, not just a profitable aerospace company, but one that stands for something. Excellence without compromise. Truth before convenience. Your father's values, Bob noted. Yes, Victoria agreed, though I'm only now beginning to understand that he meant them as more than just corporate slogans. Inside the conference room, Colonel Harris and his technical team waited alongside representatives from the Pentagon's procurement division. The atmosphere was formal, but not hostile, a positive sign. Victoria opened with a direct acknowledgement of the failure and its cause, presenting the detailed investigation findings without attempting to minimize the seriousness of the material substitution. Gentlemen, she concluded, this failure represents an unacceptable breakdown in our quality control processes. I take personal responsibility for that breakdown and have already implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent any recurrence. She gestured to Bob. Dr. Callahan will now present our technical analysis and the redesign proposals. Bob stepped forward, transforming before Victoria's eyes from the uncomfortable man in an ill-fitting suit to the confident aerospace engineer in his element. Using the technical language that military engineers respected, he walked through the failure analysis with methodical precision, then presented three alternative approaches to redesigning the turbine components. The core concept remained sound, he emphasized, pointing to simulation results displayed on the large screen. The thrust vectoring system performed exactly as designed until the material failure. With proper components, we can achieve all performance targets with significant safety margins. Colonel Harris leaned forward. Dr. Callahan, your reputation precedes you. What I'm struggling to understand is how a man who led GE's most advanced propulsion research didn't catch this material substitution before the test flight. It was a fair question and potentially damaging. Bob didn't hesitate. Because I trusted the system, Colonel. The components arrived with certification documents indicating they met specifications. I focused on the design elements under development rather than re-verifying already certified parts. He shook his head. It was a mistake, one I won't make again. The honesty of this admission, taking responsibility rather than deflecting blame, seemed to resonate with the military officials. Ms. Richards, Harris said, turning to Victoria, your approach to this failure has been refreshingly transparent. Most contractors in your position would be deploying teams of lawyers and PR specialists to create distance between themselves and the problem. That's not how Westfield operates, Colonel. Not under my leadership. Harris nodded, then looked between Victoria and Bob. We need to discuss your proposal privately. Can you give us the room for 30 minutes? Outside in the hallway, Victoria and Bob waited in tense silence. The Pentagon's decision would have far-reaching implications not just for the XGT-5 program, but for Westfield's entire military contracting future. Whatever happens, Bob said quietly, you handled this the right way. Standing up for engineering integrity over political expediency, that matters. Victoria smiled gratefully. Coming from you, that means a lot. I meant what I said in there, he continued. I should have personally verified those components. Getting comfortable trusting the system, that's when mistakes happen. We all share responsibility, Victoria replied. The corporate culture that allowed someone to substitute materials to save costs, that's on me. I've been so focused on growth targets and market expansion that I may have inadvertently signaled that financial performance trumps engineering excellence. Bob considered this. Leadership messages cascade often in ways we don't intend. The pressure to hit quarterly targets can translate into corner cutting at operational levels. Exactly, and that stops now. Victoria's determination was evident. Whatever the Pentagon decides, Westfield is returning to its foundational principles. Engineering excellence first, financial results second. After what seemed an eternity, they were called back into the conference room. Colonel Harris's expression revealed nothing as they took their seats. We've reached a decision, Papa, he began formally. Given the nature of the failure and your transparent handling of the situation, the Pentagon is prepared to continue the XGT-5 development program with Westfield Aerospace. Victoria felt a wave of relief, but Harris raised his hand before she could respond. However, we have conditions. First, we want direct access to all quality control documentation for critical components. Second, we want Dr. Callahan personally responsible for certifying that all engine components meet specifications before each test flight. And third, we want the Riverdale facility to become the primary development center for this project, not a satellite operation to Seattle. This last condition surprised both Victoria and Bob. Harris explained his reasoning. What impressed us most about the Riverdale team was their ability to quickly identify the root cause when Seattle's quality systems missed it entirely. There's something valuable in that small team hands-on approach that we don't want diluted by corporate processes. Victoria glanced at Bob, who looked equally surprised by this vote of confidence in his operation. We can accommodate those conditions, Victoria confirmed. In fact, they align with changes I was already planning to implement. As they concluded the meeting and walked the Pentagon team out, Victoria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The crisis wasn't over. There would still be fallout from the board and shareholders, but the core business relationship had been preserved. More importantly, the Pentagon's conditions essentially validated the Riverdale approach that she'd championed against internal skepticism. It was a powerful endorsement of Bob's leadership and the value of experienced engineering judgment over bureaucratic processes. Well, Bob said as they watched the military officials depart, That was unexpected, especially the part about making Riverdale the primary development center. Victoria smiled. Not entirely unexpected. Quality engineering speaks for itself, Bob. Your team proved their value when it mattered most. So what happens now? The board can't be thrilled about the Pentagon dictating operational details. The board follows the money, Victoria replied pragmatically. This contract is worth billions over its lifetime. They'll adapt to the requirements, however reluctantly. Bob looked at her skeptically. In your position, you've made some powerful enemies these past few days. Perhaps, but I've also clarified what kind of company Westfield is going to be under my leadership. Those who don't share that vision may need to reconsider their involvement. Bob shook his head in amazement. You really have changed, Victoria. The corporate executive I met in Riverdale would never have risked her position on a matter of principle. I had a good example to follow, she replied simply. Someone who showed me that professional success means little without personal integrity. The expansion of the Riverdale operation proceeded rapidly over the following months. What had started as a small-scale test facility grew into a comprehensive development center with state-of-the-art equipment housed in purposefully unpretentious surroundings. Bob remained adamant that they maintain the collaborative culture that had defined the original operation. Engineers still wore jeans and work shirts rather than business casual. Problems were still solved collaboratively with input welcomed regardless of rank or title. And local high school students, including a growing number of girls interested in STEM fields, continued to observe and participate in appropriate aspects of the work. For Victoria, the Riverdale Center became a testing ground for a different approach to corporate leadership, one that prioritized innovation and personal connection over hierarchical control. She found herself traveling to the facility at least weekly, often staying for several days, to immerse herself in the creative environment Bob had cultivated. The board, while initially skeptical, couldn't argue with results. The redesigned XGT5 engine passed its second round of high-altitude testing with unprecedented performance metrics. The Pentagon, impressed with both the technical outcomes and the transparent handling of the earlier failure, expanded Westfield's contract to include additional military applications. More surprisingly, the Riverdale model began attracting attention within the aerospace industry. Other companies sent representatives to observe the operation, curious about how a small-town facility staffed largely by engineers who'd left traditional corporate environments was outperforming major R&D centers. On a crisp spring morning, Victoria arrived at the facility to find Bob in the main hangar, deep in conversation with Michael and three other high school students. They huddled around a small jet engine component, Bob explaining some technical principle with his characteristic patience. The turbulence at the intake creates vortices that can affect compression efficiency, he was saying. That's why the leading-edge geometry is so critical. It's not just about airflow volume, but flow quality. The students nodded clearly following his explanation, despite its technical nature. Victoria noticed that Michael, now in the final months of his senior year, was not just listening, but actively contributing to the discussion, suggesting design modifications that Bob treated with genuine professional consideration. When the students departed for their afternoon classes, Victoria approached. Professor Callahan holding class again, I see. Bob smiled, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Just sharing some basics. Those kids have remarkable intuition for fluid dynamics. Michael's friend Emma spotted a potential issue with the intake design that our simulation models missed entirely. Speaking of Michael, Victoria said, I received a call from the Dean of Engineering at MIT yesterday. Apparently your son's application has created quite a stir in the admissions office. Bob's eyebrows rose. Oh, it seems they don't often get applicants who've already contributed to the design of advanced military aircraft engines. The dean wanted to verify that the recommendation letters from our engineering team weren't exaggerating Michael's involvement. Pride shone in Bob's eyes. What did you tell him? The truth, that Michael Callahan has earned every accolade through genuine contribution and exceptional aptitude. Victoria smiled. I also mentioned that Westfield has a standing offer for summer internships throughout his college years, should he be interested. That's generous, thank you. Bob hesitated. MIT is expensive even with scholarships. I've been putting aside what I can, but… Actually, Victoria interrupted gently, that's related to something I wanted to discuss with you. The board has finally approved the patent compensation package I've been pushing for. Bob looked confused. Patent compensation? For your original thrust vectoring designs, the ones Westfield has been using in modified form across our military product line. Victoria handed him a folder. Your concepts form the foundation of systems that have generated over $300 million in revenue for Westfield in the past decade. It seemed appropriate that you should share in that success. Bob opened the folder and stared at the document inside, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. This can't be right. It is. Back royalties plus ongoing participation in future licensing revenue. Victoria watched his reaction carefully. The legal department calculated fair market value based on industry standards for foundational patents. I simply insisted they honor those standards retroactively. Bob sat heavily on a nearby bench, still staring at the figures. Victoria, this would cover Michael's entire education, with enough left over to secure your future, she finished, which you've earned through your contributions to aerospace engineering. This isn't charity, Bob. It's correcting an oversight and proper attribution and compensation. He looked up at her, suspicion replacing shock. The board agreed to this voluntarily. Victoria smiled wryly. Let's just say that after the Pentagon made their continued business contingent on your leadership of the XGT-5 program, your negotiating position improved considerably. I simply helped them recognize that treating you fairly was in Westfield's long-term interest. Bob shook his head slowly. I don't know what to say. Thank you is customary, Victoria suggested with gentle humor, followed by acceptance. It's just, I walked away from all this. The patents, the recognition, the financial rewards. I made that choice consciously when Sarah died. You walked away from corporate politics in 100-hour work weeks, Victoria corrected. Not from fair compensation for your intellectual contributions. Those patents still benefit Westfield every day, whether you're actively involved or not. Bob carefully closed the folder, his weathered hands resting on its surface, as if anchoring himself against unexpected emotional currents. Michael's college is covered, he said quietly, more to himself than to Victoria. And his graduate studies if he chooses that path. As they should be, Victoria replied. The son of one of aerospace engineering's most innovative minds deserves the education of his choice. She watched as Bob processed this sudden change in his financial circumstances. Not wealth by corporate executive standards, but certainly security and comfort beyond what his small-town mechanic's salary could provide. There's something else, Victoria continued after giving him a moment. The board has approved the establishment of a new division within Westfield Advanced Propulsion Innovation. It will operate with significant autonomy, headquartered here in Riverdale, but with satellite operations near major engineering universities. Bob looked up immediately, grasping the implications. Expanding the model. Exactly. Small teams, minimal corporate interference, direct connection between design and testing. The culture you've built here, replicated strategically. And you want me involved, Bob surmised. I want you to lead it, Victoria corrected, as Chief Technical Officer reporting directly to me. No intermediate layers of management, no corporate hoops to jump through. Bob's expression turned wary. Victoria, I've told you repeatedly I'm not interested in returning to corporate life. The travel, the politics, the time away from home. Which is why the position is structured differently, she interrupted. Primarily based here in Riverdale. Limited travel, perhaps 1 week per month to other facilities. No responsibility for budgets, HR, or administrative functions. Those would be handled by a separate operational team. Your focus would be purely technical leadership. Victoria sat beside him on the bench. Bob, this isn't about forcing you back into a life you left behind. It's about creating a role that leverages your unique talents while respecting your priorities. She gestured around the hangar. What you've built here works. It's producing innovation at a pace our traditional R&D can't match. But it's currently dependent on you personally, your expertise, your approach, your values. If you want this model to outlast your direct involvement, it needs to be institutionalized in Westfield's structure. Bob considered her words carefully. And Michael, he'll be at MIT soon, but during break summers, would have his father present Just as he's had these past years, Victoria assured him. That's non-negotiable. In fact, I've already blocked all major company events during MIT's break periods to ensure there are no scheduling conflicts with his time at home. This unexpected detail that she had anticipated his concern for Michael's home time and proactively addressed it seemed to touch Bob deeply. You've thought this through, he acknowledged. Thoroughly, Victoria confirmed. This isn't a hasty offer, Bob. It's the result of months of observation board negotiations and structural planning. She stood, giving him space to process. Take some time. Discuss it with Michael. The position will be there when you are ready, whether that's next week or next year. As she turned to leave, Bob spoke again. Victoria, thank you. Not just for the offer or the patent compensation, but for seeing value in a different way of working, a different way of leading. Victoria smiled. I should be thanking you. You've changed how I think about leadership, about success, about what truly matters in the long run. She left him sitting there, the patent compensation folder still in his hands, his expression thoughtful as he gazed around the facility he'd helped create, a place where engineering excellence and human priorities existed in careful balance. Michael Callahan's high school graduation ceremony was held in Riverdale High's gymnasium, decorated with blue and gold streamers and filled to capacity with proud families. Victoria sat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous, despite her designer suit and the town's awareness of her frequent visits. She hadn't planned to attend, concerned that her presence might distract from Michael's moment. But when Bob had awkwardly extended the invitation 2 weeks earlier, Michael specifically asked if you'd come. No pressure, of course. She'd found herself surprisingly touched and immediately rearranged her schedule. The ceremony was refreshingly different from the corporate events that filled Victoria's calendar. The principal knew each student by name, then adding personal anecdotes as they crossed the stage. Parents cheered enthusiastically, some with air horns, despite repeated requests for decorum. It was messy, genuine, and deeply human. When Michael's name was called, the announcement included his selection as valedictorian and his acceptance to MIT with a prestigious engineering scholarship. Bob stood as his son crossed the stage, his face showing a father's uncomplicated pride, perhaps the purest emotion Victoria had ever witnessed. The graduation party afterward was held at the Callahan home, with neighbors, teachers, and Michael's classmates filling the modest backyard. Victoria had felt distinctly out of place initially until Bob introduced her simply as a friend from work, rather than as the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar aerospace company. The simplified introduction allowed her to blend in more naturally, engaging in conversations about local concerns rather than corporate strategies. She found herself genuinely enjoying the unpretentious celebration, with its homemade food and gentle teasing among people who had known each other for years. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Victoria found herself on the front porch with Bob, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in golden light. "Thank you for coming," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. It meant a lot to Michael. "I was honored to be included," Victoria replied sincerely. "He's an exceptional young man, Bob. You've done a remarkable job raising him." Bob smiled, his gaze on the horizon. "Sarah deserves much of the credit. She established his foundation, his character, his curiosity. I've just tried not to mess that up these past years." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only develops between people who have moved beyond professional courtesy to genuine respect. "I've been thinking about your offer," Bob said finally. "The CTO position." Victoria nodded, careful to keep her expression neutral, despite her intense interest in his decision. "I'm inclined to accept," he continued, "with a few conditions." "I'm listening." "First, I want the scholarship program expanded beyond Riverdale. Small towns across the country focused on students who have the aptitude but not the financial means." Victoria nodded. "That's entirely reasonable." "Second, I want to establish a mentorship pathway for engineers in mid-career who need to step back for family reasons, health issues, elder care, children with special needs. Too much talent is lost because corporate structures can't accommodate life's complexities." This request revealed much about how Bob viewed his own career trajectory, not as an abandonment of aerospace, but as a necessary adaptation to life circumstances that traditional corporate structures couldn't accommodate. "That would actually address a significant retention problem we've been struggling with," Victoria acknowledged. Our HR department estimates we lose over a dozen experienced engineers annually to family obligations. And third, Bob continued, his voice softening, I want to establish the Sarah Callahan Memorial Fellowship for Women in Aerospace Engineering. My wife believed deeply in encouraging girls to pursue STEM fields. This would honor her memory in a meaningful way. Victoria felt unexpectedly moved by this final request. It spoke to Bob's desire not just to secure his own position, but to create lasting positive change within the industry. Consider all three conditions accepted, she said without hesitation. I'll have legal draft the appropriate documentation. Bob nodded satisfaction rather than triumph in his expression. Then I accept the position. I'll transition after Michael leaves for MIT in August. Victoria smiled, genuine pleasure warming her voice. Westfield Aerospace just became a stronger company, Bob. Thank you. As darkness settled over the quiet neighborhood, their conversation shifted to more personal topics. Victoria's early engineering work before moving into management, Bob's adventures as a young Air Force mechanic, shared stories of mentors who had shaped their professional development. In the comfortable atmosphere of the porch, with cicadas providing a gentle soundtrack and the worries of corporate politics far away, Victoria found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey of the past year. She had arrived in Riverdale as the hard-driving CEO of Westfield Aerospace, focused exclusively on contracts and corporate expansion. She had dismissed Bob Callahan as a small-town mechanic unworthy of her professional attention. Now she considered him not just a valuable colleague, but a friend whose perspective had fundamentally altered her understanding of success. Penny, for your thoughts, Bob said, noticing her contemplative silence. Victoria smiled. I was just thinking about our first meeting, how differently I saw everything then, how narrowly I defined value and success. And now I understand that a balanced life isn't a compromise or a retreat from excellence. It's a different kind of achievement, perhaps a more difficult one than corporate advancement. Bob nodded thoughtfully. It took Sarah's death for me to learn that lesson. I'm glad you found a less painful path to the same insight. Inside the house, they could hear Michael laughing with the few remaining friends who had stayed to help clean up. The sound carried a poignant reminder that this chapter of Bob's life, the years of intensive single fatherhood, was drawing to a close. He'll be fine at MIT, Victoria said, correctly reading Bob's momentary melancholy. He's got a remarkable foundation. And Boston's not that far. I know, Bob agreed. It's just, when your life has revolved around someone else's needs for so long, it's strange to contemplate their absence, even when that absence represents exactly the success you've worked toward. Victoria considered this paradox of parenting the bittersweet achievement of raising a child to independence. So what will you do with your newfound free time once he's settled at school beyond the CTO responsibilities, I mean? Bob smiled. Rebuild the Corvette's engine. It's been running a little rough lately. Then more seriously, start living for myself again, I suppose. Find out who Bob Callahan is beyond Michael's father. Well, Victoria said, standing as she prepared to leave. Whoever that turns out to be, I look forward to working with him. And perhaps, she hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain, continuing our friendship outside of professional context. Bob stood as well, his expression warm. I'd like that. This town has some decent restaurants that don't require corporate expense accounts, and the local theater company puts on surprisingly good shows. It wasn't a romantic overture, but rather the genuine offer of continued connection from someone who valued her company beyond her professional title. In Victoria's experience, such authentic personal regard was far rarer and more precious than romantic interest. I'll hold you to that, she replied with a smile. As she drove away from the Callahan home, Victoria reflected on the symmetry of their journeys. Bob was emerging from years of single-minded focus on parenting, preparing to re-engage with his professional passion. She was moving in the opposite direction, tempering her career ambitions with a growing appreciation for personal connections and balanced priorities. Different paths converging toward a middle ground where excellence and humanity could coexist without compromise. So, the formal announcement of Westfield's Advanced Propulsion Innovation Division generated significant industry attention. Aviation journals and business publications ran profiles of the unconventional approach, highlighting Bob Callahan's return to aerospace leadership after his mysterious 5-year absence. The Pentagon's enthusiastic endorsement of the Riverdale model and their substantial financial commitment to its expansion silenced most of the internal corporate skeptics. Even the board members who had initially opposed Victoria's handling of the engine failure grudgingly acknowledged that her approach had preserved and ultimately strengthened Westfield's military contracts. 6 months after accepting the CTO position, Bob stood with Victoria in the newly constructed Advanced Propulsion headquarters on the outskirts of Riverdale. The facility represented a careful balance between modern capability and unpretentious functionality, state-of-the-art testing equipment housed in practical buildings that resembled aviation hangars more than corporate offices. "What do you think?" Victoria asked as they surveyed the completed facility. "Does it maintain the spirit of the original operation?" Bob nodded approvingly. "It does. You resisted the urge to make it flashy or imposing. That matters more than you might think." "The architects were confused when I kept rejecting their more prestigious designs," Victoria admitted with a smile. "They couldn't understand why we wanted it to look more like a working hangar than a corporate showcase." "Because engineers are practical creatures," Bob explained. "We care about functionality, not appearances. A facility that prioritizes form over function sends the wrong message about your values." They walked through the main development area where engineers worked in collaborative pods rather than isolated offices or cubicles. Large windows provided natural light and views of the surrounding countryside, while the open floor plan facilitated the spontaneous interactions that often led to breakthrough innovations. "The recruiting response has been remarkable," Victoria noted. "We've had applications from top engineers at every major aerospace company, many willing to take pay cuts to be part of this operation. Because they're tired of corporate bureaucracy stifling innovation," Bob replied. "Many brilliant engineers leave the field entirely because they can't tolerate the politics and paperwork that come with advancement. Here we're offering them a different path, one where technical excellence is valued above administrative conformity." They stopped at a wall display featuring photographs of the division's first class of scholarship recipients, high school students from small towns across America, who would receive full engineering educations and guaranteed internships at Westfield. "The Sarah Callahan Fellows," Victoria observed, reading the plaque beneath the photos. 17 young women who might otherwise never have pursued aerospace careers. Bob studied the eager young faces with evident emotion. Sarah would have loved this. She always believed that diversity of perspective was essential to innovation, that we needed different voices asking different questions to solve the hardest problems. Victoria nodded in agreement. "Your wife was ahead of her time. The industry is only now beginning to recognize what she understood years ago." As they continued their tour, Victoria's assistant approached with an urgent message. "Ms. Richards, the board chairman, is requesting an immediate video conference. He says it's regarding the quarterly projections." Victoria sighed. "Some aspects of corporate life never change. I'll take it in the conference room." When she returned 20 minutes later, her expression was tight with controlled anger. Bob, who had come to know her well enough to read her moods, immediately asked, "What happened?" "The same old story," Victoria replied, frustration evident in her voice. "Whitmore and the conservative faction are pushing for cost reductions to improve short-term financial metrics. They want to delay the expansion of the scholarship program and reduce the R&D budget for next year." Bob frowned. "Short-sighted." "Extremely, especially when our military contracts specifically cite our investment in the future talent as a competitive advantage." Victoria shook her head. "Sometimes I wonder if they understand our business at all." "What will you do?" Victoria's expression hardened with determination. "Fight them, of course. The scholarship program is non-negotiable, and cutting R&D now would be disastrous for our product pipeline." Bob studied her for a moment. "You know, 5 years ago at GE, I faced a similar battle over funding for advanced research. The finance department wanted to redirect resources to more immediate revenue opportunities. What happened?" "I lost," Bob said simply, "and 6 months later, our competitors announced breakthrough technologies we should have developed first. By the time the company recognized the mistake, we'd lost significant market share." Victoria nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent. Westfield can't compete with the industry giants on volume or price. Our advantage has always been innovation staying ahead of the curve through sustained investment in research and talent development. The board understands stock prices, Bob observed. Perhaps they need to see the correlation between innovation investment and long-term shareholder value more explicitly. Victoria's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. You're right. They need to see it, not just hear about it or read reports. She checked her watch. The board meets again next Thursday. Would you be willing to join me in presenting a different kind of case for our strategy? Bob looked wary. What exactly did you have in mind? Not a PowerPoint presentation or financial projections, Victoria assured him. Something more tangible. Something that demonstrates the real-world impact of our approach. Over the next week, Victoria and Bob worked with their teams to prepare for the board meeting. Rather than the usual formal presentation in the corporate boardroom, Victoria requested that the meeting be held at the Riverdale facility, insisting that the board members needed to see the operation firsthand to understand its value. When the day arrived, the 12 board members were flown to Riverdale on Westfield's corporate jets. Many looked distinctly uncomfortable outside their usual environment, with several checking their expensive watches repeatedly, as if calculating the hours spent away from their more important commitments. Instead of beginning with financial presentations, Victoria led them directly to the testing bay, where the next-generation prototype engine was undergoing evaluation. There, rather than taking the lead herself, she turned the presentation over to the engineering team, not the executives but the hands-on technical staff who were actually designing and building the systems. For the next hour, board members listened as the engineers explained the innovations they were developing, the problems they were solving, and most importantly, the practical applications these advances would have for Westfield's future products. The enthusiasm and expertise of the team was infectious. Even the most skeptical board members found themselves asking genuine questions, engaged by the tangible progress on display. Next, Victoria led them to the Education Center, where several scholarship recipients were participating in a summer workshop. The board watched as Bob mentored these students through a practical engineering challenge, his patience and encouragement bringing out their best thinking. These young people represent Westfield's future, Victoria explained, not just as potential employees, but as innovators who will help define aerospace technology for the next generation. Our investment in them isn't charity, it's strategic talent development, with returns that will far exceed the costs. For the final stage of the visit, Victoria had arranged a special demonstration. On the airfield adjacent to the facility, a modified Citation jet waited with its experimental engine exposed for inspection. This aircraft is equipped with the XGT-5 engine that successfully completed military testing last month, Victoria explained. What you're about to witness is the practical application of the research we've been discussing. To the board's surprise, Bob climbed into the pilot's seat. Dr. Callahan is also a certified test pilot, Victoria informed them. He'll be demonstrating the engine's capabilities personally. For the next 20 minutes, the board members watched in amazement as Bob put the aircraft through a series of maneuvers that showcased the engine's unique capabilities. Rapid thrust changes, exceptional fuel efficiency, and remarkably quiet operation even at full power. When he returned and shut down the engine, Bob approached the group with the quiet confidence of someone who had just made his point without needing to articulate it. What you've just observed, Victoria told the board, represents over $300 million in secured military contracts with projections for an additional $500 million in commercial applications over the next decade. She gestured to the facility around them. This operation, with its focus on hands-on innovation and talent development, produced these results in 18 months. Our traditional R&D centers had worked on similar concepts for 7 years, without comparable success. Harold Whitmore, the board chairman, studied Victoria thoughtfully. Your point is made, Ms. Richards, though I question whether such a theatrical presentation was necessary. With respect, Mr. Chairman, Bob interjected, sometimes seeing is believing. The value of this approach can't be fully captured in financial spreadsheets or quarterly projections. Victoria stepped forward. Gentlemen and Mrs. Chen, what you're witnessing here is not just a different approach to R&D. It's a fundamental rethinking of how aerospace innovation happens. The scholarship program, the regional development center, the emphasis on practical problem solving, these aren't separate initiatives. They're interconnected elements of a comprehensive strategy to position Westfield at the forefront of aerospace technology for decades to come. She looked each board member in the eye. The question before you isn't whether to approve a budget line item. It's whether Westfield Aerospace will lead the next generation of aviation advancement or chase competitors who are already embracing this model. The board's decision came the following week: unanimous approval with the expanded scholarship program and increased R&D budget. Several members who had been the most skeptical now became advocates, having witnessed firsthand the energy and innovation of the Riverdale operation. 1 year after the establishment of the Advanced Propulsion Innovation Division, Westfield Aerospace hosted an industry symposium at the Riverdale facility. Leaders from across the aerospace sector gathered to discuss the future of propulsion technology, with particular focus on environmental sustainability and noise reduction areas, where Westfield had established clear leadership under Bob's technical direction. The event represented a coming-out party of sorts for the Riverdale Model LOM, now being studied by business schools as an alternative approach to innovation management in technical fields. Victoria, as CEO, delivered the opening address, but intentionally kept corporate messaging to a minimum, allowing the technical achievements to speak for themselves. During a break between sessions, Victoria found herself standing with Bob on the observation deck overlooking the test field, where prototype engines were being prepared for demonstration flights. "Quite a change from that first day in the hangar," she observed, "when I dismissed you as an overconfident handyman playing with toys you didn't understand." Bob laughed. "Not my finest moment either. I was pretty dismissive of the corporate suit who couldn't recognize real engineering knowledge when she saw it." "We've both come a long way," Victoria acknowledged. Indeed they had. Under their unconventional partnership, Westfield Aerospace had transformed from a mid-sized player fighting for relevance to an innovation leader that larger competitors now watch carefully for emerging trends. The Riverdale model had expanded to 3 additional locations across the country, each maintaining the core principles of hands-on leadership, minimal bureaucracy, and close connection to local educational institutions. The Sarah Callahan Fellowship had grown to support 40 young women annually, creating a pipeline of diverse talent that was already enriching Westfield's technical capabilities. For Victoria personally, the journey had been equally transformative. She still drove Westfield with characteristic determination, but her definition of success had expanded beyond financial metrics to include the human impact of their work, both on employees and on the communities they served. She had even begun taking regular flying lessons again, reconnecting with the joy of aviation that had first drawn her to the industry before corporate responsibilities had consumed her schedule. The Sunday afternoon flights that had once been her only respite from work were now complemented by midweek sessions where she practiced not in her personal citation, but in smaller aircraft that demanded more hands-on piloting skill. Bob, too, had found a new balance. With Michael thriving at MIT and interning at Westfield during breaks, he had expanded his own horizons, rebuilding the Corvette as promised, mentoring young engineers, occasionally even dating, though he spoke little about that aspect of his life. Most importantly, he had found a way to contribute his exceptional talents to aerospace advancement without sacrificing the personal values he held dear. His leadership style, prioritizing practical problem-solving over corporate politics, had become a model not just within Westfield, but increasingly across the industry. Michael called yesterday, Bob mentioned, as they watched the test preparations below. He's been accepted to the Advanced Propulsion Research Program. Only sophomore to make it in. Victoria smiled. "I'm not surprised. He has his father's talent. And his mother's determination," Bob added. "He's already talking about graduate school, maybe a PhD, wants to focus on sustainable aviation fuels." "The field needs young innovators like him," Victoria observed. "The environmental challenges facing aviation are immense." Bob nodded in agreement. He mentioned he might be interested in the Westfield Summer Research Program again, if that's still an option. "Always," Victoria assured him, "though I suspect we'll be competing with several other companies for his talents before long." They fell into comfortable silence, watching the bustle of activity below as engineers prepared for the afternoon's demonstrations. Despite their different paths to this moment, they shared a deep appreciation for the technical excellence on display, the elegant solutions to complex problems that defined aerospace engineering at its best. "I got a call from the National Aviation Hall of Fame last week," Victoria said casually. They're planning to induct you next year for your contributions to propulsion technology. Wanted to know if you'd accept. Bob looked genuinely surprised. That's unexpected. But well-deserved, Victoria insisted. Your work has fundamentally changed how we approach engine design. The fuel efficiency improvements alone have environmental impacts that will outlast both of us. Bob seemed uncomfortable with the recognition. It's not about individual achievement. Engineering is collaborative by nature. True, Victoria acknowledged, but leadership matters. Direction matters. The questions you chose to pursue and the values you brought to that pursuit, those are uniquely yours. Before Bob could respond, they were interrupted by an assistant informing them that the next session was about to begin. As they walked back toward the conference center, Victoria added one final thought. You know, Bob, sometimes our greatest impact isn't through the products we create, but through the people we influence. The young engineers you've mentored, the approach to innovation you've modeled, that legacy will continue through generations of aerospace advancement. Bob considered this perspective thoughtfully. Perhaps, though I suspect most of us won't know our true impact until long after we're gone. A bit like parenting, Victoria observed. You plant seeds without knowing exactly how they'll grow. Exactly like parenting, Bob agreed with a smile. The most important engineering project of all, helping shape the next generation who will solve problems we haven't even recognized yet. As they rejoined the symposium, surrounded by aerospace leaders and emerging talents from across the industry, both Victoria Richards and Bob Callahan recognized the symmetry of their journey. Two people from vastly different circumstances who had initially misjudged each other based on appearances had found common ground in their commitment to excellence, integrity, and leaving the world better than they found it. Their unlikely partnership had not only transformed Westfield Aerospace, but had reshaped each of their lives, expanding Victoria's definition of success beyond corporate achievement and giving Bob a way to contribute his exceptional talents without compromising his personal values. Different paths, different priorities, but a shared commitment to the principle that true excellence encompasses both professional achievement and human connection. Engineering solutions that advance technology while respecting the people behind the innovations. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that the most powerful advances come not from choosing between technical excellence and human priorities, but from finding the sweet spot where both can flourish together.